Welcome, dear listener, to another journey through the annals of history. As you settle in for a moment of calm and reflection, I invite you to leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. I love seeing how far our community of night owls stretches. If you enjoy these quiet excursions into the past, be sure to subscribe for more tales that blend historical insight with soothing storytelling. Tonight we embark on an exploration of a world both familiar and foreign. The bustling, smoggy streets of Victorian England. It was an era marked by dramatic change as the Industrial Revolution reshaped every facet of British life. Steam engines churned, factories belched smoke, and cities swelled with workers seeking their fortunes. But amidst this time of progress and empire, there existed a darker reality for the labouring class, one of squalor, strife, and staggeringly difficult work. In the coming hour, we'll delve into some of the most grueling and glimpsed trades of the Victorian era. Through the eyes of the men, women, and children who toiled in these roles, we'll gain a sobering glimpse into the hardships endured by so many during this pivotal chapter in history. So, blow out the candle, rest your head, and let us transport you back to a time when survival itself was a hard day's work. As the sun rose over the SI skyline of Victorian London, its rays struggled to penetrate the thick haze that shrouded the city. The air hung heavy with the stench of industry, a noxious blend of coal smoke, chemical fumes, and human waste. In the teeming slums, factory whistles pierced the early morning quiet, summoning legions of workers to their posts. Among the grim-faced labourers filing into the factories were children. Small soot-stained figures dwarfed by the massive machinery that rumbled to life around them. For countless Victorian youngsters, childhood was a luxury they could scarcely afford. From the tender age of 4 or 5, many were sent to work by families desperate to escape the clutches of poverty. One such child was Elizabeth Burland, a bright-eyed 8-year-old with a tangle of dark hair and an impish grin. But there was little cause for smiling as young Elizabeth descended into the dank, dark belly of a Yorkshire coal mine each morning. As a trapper girl, her job was to open and close the wooden doors that regulated airflow through the mine shafts, allowing coal carts to pass. For 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, Elizabeth sat alone in the inky darkness, straining to hear the approach of carts over the distant clamour of picks on rock. With only a flickering oil lamp for company, she fought to stay awake, knowing all too well the dangers that lurked in the gloom. Cave-ins, explosions, and deadly gases claimed the lives of countless miners, a staggering 1,000 each year in Elizabeth's time. Though just a small cog in the mining machine, Elizabeth's job was crucial to the smooth flow of coal that powered the British Empire's grand ambitions. But like so many working-class children, her contribution came at a devastating cost. Deprived of sunlight, fresh air, and schooling, Elizabeth and her young comrades in the mines grew up stunted in both body and mind. As we picture Elizabeth huddled in the damp darkness, her childhood sacrificed on the altar of industry, it's hard not to feel a deep pang of sorrow. But her plight was all too common in Victorian England, where the demand for cheap labour outweighed any notions of morality or human dignity. In coal mines across the country, an army of Elizabeth Burlands toiled in obscurity. Their small hands and slight frames, ideal for worming into narrow seams of coal. Conditions in the mines were nothing short of hellish. Miners spent their shifts stooped in low tunnels no more than 2 feet high, their lungs filled with coal dust and their skin caked with grime. Accidents were commonplace and often horrific. Limbs crushed by falling rock, bodies hurled against walls by explosions, lungs seared by pockets of deadly gas. But perhaps most appalling was the fate that awaited many miners after years in the pits. A slow, suffocating death from black lung disease. Caused by the relentless inhalation of coal dust, black lung gradually ate away at miners' lungs until they could barely draw breath. It was a cruel irony that the very substance that sustained the British Empire also claimed the lives of so many of its subjects. As the 19th century wore on, miners began to push back against the brutal conditions that defined their lives. Unions formed, strikes were called, and the plight of the miners slowly seeped into public consciousness. But progress was painfully slow, and it would take decades of bitter struggle before reforms like child labor laws and safety regulations began to take hold. For Elizabeth Burland and the countless other children who sacrificed their youth in the mines, though, such changes came too late. As we imagine Elizabeth emerging from the pit at the end of a long shift, her face smudged with grime and her eyes hollow with exhaustion, we're left to wonder what kind of life awaited her. Would she escape the mines and find a better future? Or would she, like so many of her peers, be forever trapped in the cycle of poverty and hardship that define the Victorian working class? As the sun sets on another day in Victorian England, the clatter of the mines fades into the distance, replaced by the clang and clatter of a different sort of machine. Looming on the outskirts of cities like Birmingham and Manchester are sprawling brick buildings that belie the misery within. The textile mills that employed thousands of women and children in conditions scarcely better than those in the coal mines. Inside these cavernous factories, the air is thick with floating fibers that catch in the throat and sting the eyes. The thunderous racket of the looms is almost deafening, making it impossible to hear anything beyond the unending clatter of shuttles shooting back and forth. At long tables sit rows of one-weary women and children. Their nimble fingers a blur as they feed fabric into the insatiable maws of the machines. Among these textile workers is 17-year-old Patience Kershaw. Her once bright eyes now dulled by years of unrelenting toil. Like so many of her fellow mill girls, Patience started working at the age of 6, her tiny hands deft at picking bits of debris from the great mechanical looms. Now, more than a decade later, she sits hunched over her station for 16 hours a day. Her shoulders permanently stooped from years spent bent over the machines. The work is mindless and repetitive, offering no respite from the sweltering heat and stale air of the mill. But for Patience and her peers, there is no choice but to endure. With wages as low as a few shillings a week, every penny is needed to keep hunger at bay and a roof overhead. But the true cost of the mill girl's labor cannot be measured in mere pennies. Like the miners, they too fall victim to a devastating occupational illness, brown lung, a chronic respiratory disease caused by inhaling textile fibers day after day, year after year. Patience has already lost 2 sisters to the disease, their once vibrant lungs reduced to shriveled, useless sacs by decades of exposure to the fibrous dust. Even more heartrending is the fate of the youngest workers, the so-called scavengers who dart beneath the clacking machines to snatch up scraps of fallen fabric before they can jam the equipment. These children, some as young as 5 years old, risk life and limb for a few extra pennies, their small size making them ideal for navigating the tight spaces under the looms. For Patience Kershaw, the hardships of mill life are thrown into stark relief when she is called to testify before a group of British lawmakers investigating working conditions in the textile industry. In a trembling voice, she recounts the toll that the work has taken on her body and spirit. Her words painting a grim picture of a childhood sacrificed on the factory floor. I have been working in the mill since I was 6 years old. Patience begins, her gaze downcast. The work is hard and the hours are long. In the summer, it is so hot in the factory that we can hardly breathe. In the winter, our hands are so cold that we can scarcely feel them. She goes on to describe the constant hunger that gnaws at her belly, the aching exhaustion that seeps into her bones, and the relentless cough that racks her lungs. By the time she finishes speaking, there is hardly a dry eye in the room. But for all the Law Macaca sympathy, little changes in the years that follow. The wheels of industry continue to turn, fueled by the sweat and suffering of girls like Patience. As night falls over the textile towns of England, the looms slowly wind down and the factory doors swing shut. Patience Kershaw and her fellow workers spill out into the darkened streets, their weary faces etched with the lines of premature age. For a few precious hours they are free from the clamour and confinement of the mill, but in the morning they will rise before the sun and do it all again. Another day older, another day closer to the fate that awaits so many in their line of work. It is a bleak picture, this world of the Victorian textile worker. But it is one that we must confront if we are to understand the true cost of the Industrial Revolution, not just in pounds and pence, but in human lives and livelihoods. Through the eyes of girls like Patience Kershaw, we glimpse the grim reality behind the grand facade of Victorian progress. As we leave the mills behind and venture deeper into the underbelly of Victorian industry, the air grows thick with a new stench. The unmistakable reek of decay and putrefaction. We have entered the realm of the tanneries, where animal hides are transformed into leather through a gruesome process that turns even the strongest stomach. In the fated alleyways of London's Bermoney district, the tanning trade is at its most noxious. Here the streets literally run red with blood and offal. The cobblestones slick with the grotesque byproducts of the leather-making process. The stench is overwhelming, a stomach-churning blend of rotting flesh, caustic chemicals and human sweat. Inside the tanneries themselves, conditions are even worse. Men toil waist-deep in vats of putrid animal hides, their skin flayed raw by the lime and acids used to strip away hair and flesh. The work is hellish and hazardous, exposing the tanners to a host of deadly diseases borne by the festering animal carcasses. Infections run rampant in these fated workplaces, with cuts and scrapes quickly turning septic in the filthy, contaminated water. Respiratory illnesses are also common. As the tanners inhale noxious fumes from the chemicals used to treat the hides, many develop chronic bronchitis and other lung ailments, their chests rattling with every laboured breath. But perhaps most horrifying of all is the spectre of anthrax, a deadly disease contracted from infected animal hides. The spores of the bacteria can linger on hides for years, lying in wait for an unsuspecting tanner to come into contact with them. Once infected, victims face a gruesome demise, their bodies ravaged by high fevers, bleeding sores and organ failure. It is against this grim backdrop that we meet Charles Booth, a Victorian social reformer who made it his mission to document the appalling conditions in London's tanneries. Armed with a notebook and an unflinching gaze, Booth ventured into the heart of Bermoney, determined to shine a light on the human cost of the leather trade. What he found there was a veritable hellscape, a world where men were treated as little more than disposable cogs in a vast and vicious machine. Vicious. In page after page of meticulous notes, Booth recorded the harrowing stories of tanners crippled by disease, disfigured by accidents, and discarded by their employers when they could no longer keep up with the brutal pace of production. But Booth's work was more than just a catalogue of human misery. It was a clarion call for change, a searing indictment of a society that prized profit over people. His findings helped to galvanize a growing movement for workers' rights, one that would slowly but surely begin to chip away at the edifice of industrial exploitation. As we picture Charles Booth picking his way through the blood-sicked streets of Bermoney, his nose wrinkled against the stench, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe at his courage and conviction. In a time when the suffering of the working class was often ignored or overlooked, he dared to bear witness to their plight and to demand better for them. But even as we celebrate Booth's legacy, we must also reckon with the grim reality that he exposed. For every small victory won by reformers like him, countless lives were lost or ruined in the tanneries and other industrial hellholes of Victorian England. The leather we so prize today, the buttery soft gloves, the supple shoes, the luxurious handbags, all came at a cost measured in human misery. As the moon rises over the tannery towns, casting a pallid glow over the blood-stained cobblestones, we are left to ponder the true price of progress. How many lives were sacrificed? How many bodies broken to fuel the engines of industry? And what do we owe to the memory of those who toiled and suffered in places like Burma? Their stories lost to time, but their suffering etched into the very fabric of our modern world. These are the questions that haunt us as we move on from the tanneries. Our steps heavy with the weight of what we have witnessed, but there are more dark corners of Victorian industry to explore, more grim trades to confront in our journey through this shadowy chapter of history. Our path takes us now to the match factories of London's East End, where a different sort of horror lurks behind the cheery facade of the match girls and their wares. At first glance, the matchstick trade seems almost quaint. Rows of young women seated at long tables, deftly dipping and bundling the tiny wooden sticks that will light the lamps and stoves of England. But the reality of life as a match girl was far from idyllic. The matches they made were cheap and plentiful, but they came at a terrible cost to the workers who produced them. The key ingredient in these early matches was white phosphorus, a highly toxic substance that could cause devastating health effects with prolonged exposure. For the match girls who spent their days handling this noxious chemical, the risks were all too real. Many developed a condition known as FSI jaw, a grotesque and painful degeneration of the jawbone caused by phosphorus poisoning. The affliction often began with aching teeth and gums, but quickly progressed to the horrific. The jawbone literally rotting away, leaving gaping holes and protruding bone fragments. The match girls also faced other dire health consequences from their work. Inhaling the toxic fumes of the phosphorus caused serious damage to the brain and other organs, leading to tremors, seizures, and even premature death. And like so many other Victorian workers, the match girls toiled in abysmal conditions with poor ventilation, inadequate sanitation, and virtually no safety precautions. One of the most poignant voices to emerge from this grim trade was that of Kate Slater, a teenage match girl who became a reluctant leader in the fight for better working conditions. Slater was just 15 years old when she began working at the Bryant and May match factory in London's Bow District, one of the largest and most notorious producers of phosphorus matches. From the start, Slater was appalled by what she saw at the factory. The sickly power of the workers, the noxious fumes that hung in the air, the cruel indifference of the managers to the suffering of their employees. But like so many of her fellow match girls, she had little choice but to endure the hardships of the job, her meager wages barely enough to keep her family afloat. It was only when Slater herself began to suffer the ravages of FSI jaw that she found the courage to speak out. With her jaw swollen and aching, she penned a letter to the London newspaper, The Link, detailing the horrific conditions in the match factories and calling for action to protect the health and safety of the workers. Slater's letter caused a sensation, sparking a wave of public outrage and calls for reform. But the match companies were powerful and well-connected, and they fought tooth and nail to resist any changes to their profitable business model or business. It would take a full-scale strike by the match girls, led by the fiery and determined activist Annie Besant, to finally force the companies to abandon the use of white phosphorus and improve conditions in the factories. The match girl strike of 1888 was a pivotal moment in the history of workers' rights, a rare victory for the downtrodden and exploited labourers of Victorian England. But for Kate Slater and so many of her fellow match girls, the victory came too late to undo the damage that had already been done. Slater herself would die just a few years later, her body ravaged by the effects of phosphorus poisoning. As we reflect on the tragedy of the match girls and the courage of activists like Kate Slater and Annie Besant, it's hard not to feel a sense of both sorrow and admiration. Sorrow for the countless lives cut short or blighted by the callous greed of the match companies. Admiration. The grave-digging trade also had an even darker side, the ghoulish business of body snatching. In the early 1800s, the demand for human cadavers for medical dissection and research far exceeded the legal supply. At the time, the only bodies legally permitted for dissection were those of executed criminals, which were few and far between. This shortage led to a brisk underground trade in illicitly obtained corpses fresh from the grave. Professional body snatchers, or resurrectionists as they were known, would stalk cemeteries at night awaiting the next funeral. Once the moorers had gone and the coast was clear, they would dig up the freshly interred body, taking great care not to steal the clothes or jewelry, as that would be a separate crime of theft. The corpse would be swiftly hauled away to be sold to the highest bidder from the many anatomy schools desperate for subjects. An experienced body snatcher could expect to fetch around £4 per corpse, a princely sum when a week's wage might be 10 shillings. For grave robbers, business was certainly booming in the crowded cities of Victorian Britain. Some body snatchers even turned to murder to supply the demand for fresh specimens. This was the gruesome downfall of the infamous duo William Burke and William Hare, two Irish labourers in Edinburgh who went from snatching bodies to committing at least 16 murders over the course of a year. They would lure victims, often intoxicated or elderly, to the boarding house Hare ran with his wife before suffocating them and selling the fresh bodies to the esteemed Dr. Robert Knox for his anatomy lectures. Their crimes were discovered when another lodger found the body of their final victim, Marjorie Campbell Doherty, under a bed. Hare turned on Burke and testified against him to save his own skin. The lurid murder trial that followed was a national sensation. Burke was found guilty, hanged before a cheering crowd of thousands. And rather ironically, his body was donated to medical science and publicly dissected. Hare escaped prosecution and disappeared. Though in one last macabre twist, his death mask was a popular attraction at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. The moral outcry over the Burke and Hare murders helped lead to the passage of the 1832 Anatomy Act, which expanded the legal supply of medical cadavers to include unclaimed bodies from prisons and workhouses, thus effectively putting the resurrectionists out of business. But for years, the grisly exploits of the body snatchers had given the grave diggers' trade a rather sinister reputation. From the depths of the earth, let us now turn our gaze upward to the tops of the buildings that made up the crowded skyline of Victorian cities. There we find the stomping grounds of another wretched and perilous profession, the chimney sweeps. In the time of Charles Dickens, when coal fires burned in nearly every room of every building, creosote and ash would quickly build up inside chimneys, requiring them to be cleaned regularly to prevent toxic fumes and fires. This was the hazardous and heartbreaking lot of the chimney sweep. The work of a chimney sweep was often done by young children, some as young as 4 or 5 years old, who were small enough to climb up inside the narrow brick chimneys. These climbing boys, as they were called, were usually parish orphans who had been essentially sold by the church into indentured servitude to a master sweep. Their days began in the dark hours before dawn. Still half asleep, they would be forced to climb nearly naked up into the pitch-black chimneys with only a small candle strapped to their head to light the way. Using their elbows, knees and toes, they would shimmy their way up the flue, scraping the built-up soot off the sides as they went. When they reached the top, if their head emerged from the chimney pot, they would announce their success with a shout of sweep before descending back into the darkness. It was claustrophobic, filthy, and incredibly dangerous work. These tiny children could easily slip and fall, breaking bones or worse. They constantly breathed in the carcinogenic chimney soot, and many suffered a chronic cough and black lung. The soot was so abrasive it could wear their skin raw, and many climbing boys developed painful, infected sores on their elbows and knees that never healed. If a child seemed reluctant to climb, it was common for the master sweep to light a small fire in the grate to encourage them up the flue. This was the terrible fate of poor young George Brewster in 1863. Only 12 years old, George had been sent up the chimney of Fulbourn Hospital in Cambridge by his master, William Wire. But the flue was narrow and George became stuck fast, unable to move up or down as soot rained down upon him. A rescue was attempted from above, but it was too late. After 11 harrowing hours wedged in the darkness, George suffocated to death. The subsequent inquest into his death helped strengthen the laws that would finally ban the use of climbing boys. One of the most famous champions of the climbing boys was a man named James Seaward, who had himself been apprenticed as a sweep at the tender age of 6. For 7 brutal years, Seaward suffered the miseries and hazards of the work until he finally worked up the courage to run away from his abusive master. He found work as a kitchen boy in a pub, but never forgot the plight of his fellow climbing boys. When he grew up, Searwood became a vocal advocate for the rights of child sweeps, giving speeches, writing articles, and lobbying Parliament for reform. Thanks in part to his efforts, the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act was passed in 1840, prohibiting sweeps from taking on apprentices younger than 16. Though this law was often flouted and climbing boys remained in use for decades more, it was an important step towards ending this cruel practice. The sombre legacy of Searwood and the climbing boys is a stark reminder of the human cost of the Victorian era's rapid industrialisation and urbanisation. The squalid and hazardous conditions endured by chimney sweeps, grave diggers, rat catchers, leech collectors, and so many other workers of the time can seem almost unfathomably grim to us today, but their suffering was not in vain. The pain and struggles of the Victorian working class helped fuel the labour movements and social reforms that would slowly but surely improve conditions not just in Britain but around the industrialised world. Child labour laws, workplace safety regulations, limits on working hours. These are all protections that were hard won by organisers and advocates who were determined to ease the burden of even the lowliest workers. Today we might wrinkle our noses at the thought of spending our days collecting leeches or hauling night soil, and that's a good thing. It means we've made progress, but this progress is not a destiny. It is an achievement, one that took the collective action and courage of generations. There are still far too many places in the world today where people continue to toil in conditions as dismal as any in Denzian London. So while the worst jobs of Victorian Britain may seem a distant memory, they remain a potent lesson for us all. They remind us of the injustice we are capable of inflicting on our fellow human beings in the name of profit and progress. But they also remind us of the power we have to make change when we stand together. The story of the Victorian working class is ultimately one of resilience, solidarity, and hope in the face of even the most dire circumstances. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for the men, women, and children who endured the worst jobs of the Victorian age. In their struggles, we see the lengths we still must go to build a world of dignity and justice for all. But in their triumphs, we see the strength of the human spirit to carry on and fight for something better, no matter how dark the night. Perhaps there is some cold comfort in knowing that our modern-day trials and tribulations, as trying as they may seem, are but a shadow of what generations past had to endure. And if they could find the courage to keep going, to work towards a brighter dawn, then surely we can too. The dreadful work of rat catching. In the teeming cities of Victorian England, where narrow streets were choked with rubbish and open sewers flowed freely, an enemy lurked in the shadows. Rats. Millions upon millions of them thriving in the squalor, spreading disease and destruction wherever their whiskered noses led them. To combat this pestilent scourge, a unique profession emerged, the rat catcher. Armed with traps, poisons, and trusty terriers, these brave souls ventured into the darkest corners of London, Liverpool, and Manchester, doing battle with the furry legions. But it was a thankless task fraught with hazards. The typical rat catcher was a rough, honeyed man of the lower classes, often a street-smart urchin who had grown up scrapping for survival. He would set out at dusk when the vermin began to stir, his pockets filled with poisoned bait, and his faithful dogs trotting at his heels. The dogs, usually tough Jack Russell or Yorkshire Terriers, were the real stars of the show, bred for their courage and quick reflexes. With a sharp whistle and a point of the finger, the rat catcher would send his eager hounds charging into the fray, dispatching dozens of squealing rats with each snap of their jaws. It was a grisly sight, this dance of death between canine and rodent. But it was a necessary one, for without the rat catchers, the cities would have been overrun, succumbing to the Black Death and other horrors borne by the rats. But the job was not without its risks. Rat bites were an occupational hazard, and many a catcher bore the scars of countless nips and gnashes. Far worse, though, was the spectre of disease. Rats carried all manner of pestilence from bubonic plague to typhus to salmonella. And in the close quarters of a rat-baiting den where man and beast mingled in a sweaty, blood-soaked embrace, contagion spread like wildfire. Then there were the rat pits. In a peculiar twist of Victorian entertainment, rat catchers would sometimes stage gruesome spectacles, releasing their dogs into pits filled with hundreds of rats, and taking bets on how many the canines could kill in a set time. The crowds would roar and cheer as the desperate rats fought for their lives, a writhing mass of fur and fangs. It was a sickening display, but a profitable one for the rat catchers who pocketed the wages. Perhaps the most famous of all rat catchers was Jack Black, a diminutive Londoner with a quick wit and a way with animals. Born in the slums of Battersea in 1833, Black learned the trade from his father and grandfather, both renowned in the ratting world. By the age of 10, young Jack was already a master, able to flush out a nest of rats with little more than a stick and a stern glare. Black's reputation grew, and soon he was in high demand among the city's elite. He caught rats in the Houses of Parliament, in the Tower of London, and even in Buckingham Palace itself, where he was appointed as Queen Victoria's official rat catcher. It was a post he would hold for over 2 decades, earning a handsome salary and no small measure of celebrity. But for all his success, Black never forgot his humble roots. He was a fierce advocate for the working class, speaking out against the appalling conditions in the city's slums and championing the rights of his fellow rat catchers. In his later years, he even penned a memoir, Rat Catching for the Use of Schools, in which he shared his hard-earned wisdom and colourful anecdotes. Jack Black died in 1902, a legend in his own time, but his legacy lives on, a testament to the grit and determination of those who toiled in the shadows of Victorian society. The rat catchers may have been unsung heroes, their work unpleasant and unappreciated, but without them, the grand edifice of the British Empire might well have crumbled under the weight of its own filth and pestilence. The nauseating job of leech collecting. In the annals of Victorian medicine, few creatures were as revered as the humble leech. These slimy serpentine worms were believed to be a panacea for all manner of ailments, from headaches to hemorrhoids. Doctors prescribed them with abandon, convinced that the blood-sucking parasites could siphon away ill humours and restore balance to the body. But where did all these leeches come from? The answer, often as not, was from the hands of the leech collectors, a hardy breed of men and women who waded into ponds and streams, offering their own flesh as bait for the insatiable annelids. It was a grueling and thankless job, one that fell mainly to the poor and desperate. Many leech collectors were women and children, deemed more expendable than their male counterparts. They would set out at dawn, armed with nothing more than a shallow wooden pail and a stout pair of boots, and spend hours standing motionless in the murky water, waiting for the leeches to latch on. The sensation of a leech bite was said to be curiously painless at first, a cold kiss, followed by a gentle sucking. But as the worm gorged itself on blood, its body swelling to many times its original size, the wound would begin to throb and sting. A skilled collector could endure dozens, even hundreds of bites in a single session, emerging from the water, pale and dizzy, their legs stippled with weeping sores. The hazards of the job were manifold. Blood loss was a constant danger, with some collectors fainting or even dying from the sheer volume of leeches feeding upon them. Infections were rampant, the bites often turning septic in the filthy, stagnant water. And then there were the occasional mishaps, like the unfortunate soul who accidentally swallowed a leech while bending down to drink, only to feel it wriggling in their throat for days afterward. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of leech collecting was the sheer scale of the enterprise. At the height of the Victorian leech craze, tens of millions of the creatures were being imported from across Europe each year, with collectors scouring every pond and puddle to meet the insatiable demand. In some areas, entire ecosystems were stripped bare. The once abundant leeches hunted to the brink of local extinction. One of the most famous leech collecting grounds was the Norfolk Broads, a vast network of wetlands in eastern England. There, in the misty marshes and sluggish rivers, armies of collectors plied their trade, shipping barrels of writhing, bloodthirsty worms off to the great hospitals of London and beyond. Among them was Teresa Smith, a widow with 6 hungry children to feed. Day after day, she would trudge out into the fence, her skirts hiked up around her waist, and stand like a statue in the chest-deep water. On a good day, she could collect 500 or more leeches, enough to earn a few shillings to keep her family afloat for another week. But it was a precarious existence, one that left little room for error or misfortune. When Teresa fell ill with fever, likely from an infected bite, she had no choice but to keep working, her skin burning and her head swimming as she stumbled through the swamps. By the time she collapsed, delirious and shaking, she had filled her pail to the brim with fat, glossy leeches, a final, poignant testament to her grim determination. Teresa Smith survived her ordeal, but many others were not so lucky. The leech trade claimed countless lives over the years, a quiet toll of suffering and sacrifice that went largely unnoticed by the wider world. Today, the practice of leech collecting is all but extinct, rendered obsolete by modern medicine and changing attitudes. But for those who toiled in the ponds and streams of Victorian England, offering up their blood to feed the ravenous appetites of the age, it remains a haunting and indelible memory, the precarious work of chimney sweeps. In the sigh shadows of Victorian England, there was no job more wretched or more perilous than that of the chimney sweep. These grimy, soot-stained wretches, many of them mere children, were the unsung heroes of the age, their small bodies and nimble fingers perfectly suited to the cramped, claustrophobic confines of the nation's chimneys. The life of a sweep was a brutal one, a never-ending cycle of back-breaking labour and lurking dangers. They would rise before dawn, their lungs already heavy with the residue of 1,000 fires, and set out into the chill morning air, armed with nothing more than a few crude tools and a stout heart. Their first task was to climb, shimmying up the narrow, winding flue with the agility of squirrels. It was a treacherous ascent, the bricks rough and jagged beneath their hands, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Many sweeps fell to their deaths over the years, plummeting from great heights or suffocating in the airless, soot-choked passages. But for those who made it to the top, the real work was just beginning. Using long, flexible brushes and their own skinny arms, they would scour the chimney from top to bottom, dislodging great clouds of ash and debris that rained down upon them like black snow. The heat was often unbearable, the air thick with noxious fumes that seared their lungs and stung their eyes. And always there was the danger of getting stuck. The Victorian chimneys were notoriously narrow and twisting, their dimensions based more on aesthetic whimsy than any concern for human safety. Many a sweep found himself wedged tight in some impossible crevice, his cries for help muffled by the suffocating soot, his fate sealed by the unyielding brick and mortar. Such was the fate of poor George Brewster, a spindly 12-year-old from Bedfordshire. George had been apprenticed to a master sweep at the tender age of 6, his parents too poor to feed him and too desperate to care what became of him. For 6 long years he had toiled in the chimneys, his once bright eyes dulled by the endless darkness, his once nimble limbs stiffened by the cramped, contorted positions he was forced to hold for hours on end. On a cold February morning in 1832, George set out to clean the chimneys of a grand manor house, his brush and his wits his only companions. He shinned up the flue with practiced ease, his mind wandering to thoughts of the meagre breakfast that awaited him back at the sweep's lodgings. But then, without warning, his foot slipped on a loose brick, and he found himself plummeting downward, his body wedged tight in the narrow passage. George screamed for help, his voice raw and ragged, but no one came. For 3 long days he languished there, his limbs slowly numbing, his mind unraveling in the darkness. When they finally found him, his body was cold and still, his face frozen in a reach of terror and despair. George Brewster's story was not unique. Countless other climbing boys met similar fates over the years, their short, brutal lives snuffed out in the depths of England's chimneys. But their plight did not go unnoticed. As the Victorian era progressed, reformers began to speak out against the cruelty and danger of the chimney sweep trade, calling for new laws and regulations to protect the vulnerable children who were its lifeblood. One such reformer was James Seawood himself, a former climbing boy who had miraculously survived the horrors of the chimney and gone on to become a successful businessman and inventor. Seawood used his wealth and influence to lobby for change, testifying before Parliament and penning impassioned editorials in the London Times. Thanks in part to Seawood's efforts, the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 was passed, prohibiting the use of climbing boys under the age of 21 and mandating the use of mechanical sweeping devices instead. It was a landmark victory for the rights of working children, a rare moment of compassion and justice in an era often marked by callousness and exploitation. But for the generations of climbing boys who had come before, the scars of the chimney would never fully heal. They carried the weight of their experiences with them always, in the hacking coughs and stunted limbs, in the nightmares that jolted them awake in the dead of night. Theirs was a legacy of suffering and sacrifice, a grim reminder of the human cost of progress and prosperity. Today, the chimney sweeps of Victorian England are little more than a fading memory, their hardships and heroism largely forgotten by a world that has moved on to brighter, cleaner horizons. But for those who pause to look back, to peer into the sigh shadows of history, their story remains a powerful testament to the resilience and the fragility of the human spirit. Conclusion. As we come to the end of our journey through the worst jobs of Victorian England, it is impossible not to feel a sense of awe and admiration for the men, women, and children who toiled in such unimaginable conditions. Theirs was a world of darkness and danger, of backbreaking labor and lurking perils, where even the most basic human needs for safety, for dignity, for a chance at a better life were too often denied. But it was also a world of remarkable resilience and courage, of ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges with grit and determination. From the coal miners who risked their lives in the depths of the earth, to the matchstick makers who fought for safer working conditions. From the rat catchers who battled the plague in the shadows, to the leech collectors who offered up their own blood for the sake of others. These were the unsung heroes of the Victorian age, the ones who kept the gears of progress turning even as they paid the highest of prices. Their sacrifices were not in vain. The hardships and horrors they endured helped to fuel the great social and political movements of the 19th and early 20th centuries. From the rise of trade unions to the push for women's suffrage, to the campaigns for child labor laws and factory safety regulations. Slowly but surely, the tide began to turn as reformers and activists fought to bring light to the dark corners of Victorian society and to secure a better future for the generations to come. Today we live in a world that is in many ways unrecognizable from the one our Victorian ancestors knew. Our workplaces are safer, our labor laws stronger, our opportunities for education and advancement greater than ever before. But the struggle for justice and dignity in the workplace is far from over. Around the globe, millions of people still toil in conditions that would be all too familiar to the chimney sweeps and match girls of old, their basic rights and freedoms denied in the name of profit and progress. As we reflect on the worst jobs of Victorian England, then let us do so with a sense not just of horror, but of hope. Let us remember the courage and the sacrifice of those who came before us, and let us commit ourselves to carrying on their legacy of activism and change. For in the end, the story of the Victorian workplace is not just a story of suffering and exploitation, but also one of resilience and resistance, of ordinary people coming together to demand a better world for themselves and for generations yet to come. It is a story that reminds us, even in our darkest and most difficult moments, of the enduring power of the human spirit to overcome adversity and to build a brighter future. And it is a story that calls us now more than ever to stand in solidarity with all those who labor in the shadows and to fight for a world where every worker, no matter their race or gender or station in life, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. So let us remember the worst jobs of Victorian England not as a distant and irrelevant curiosity, but as a powerful reminder of the work that still needs to be done. Let us honor the memory of those who toiled and suffered in the factories and the mines, in the graveyards and the chimney stacks, by rededicating ourselves to the cause of justice and equality for all. And let us never forget that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope for a better tomorrow. The nauseating work of leech collecting was just one of the many dreadful and dangerous jobs that plagued the Victorian working class. As we've explored, from the cramped coal mines to the suffocating textile mills, Labourers in 19th century Britain endured unimaginable hardships simply to scrape by a meagre living. But perhaps no occupation was as precarious and potentially deadly as that of the chimney sweep. In the days before modern heating systems, most buildings in Victorian England relied on fireplaces and coal-burning stoves for warmth. And all those chimneys needed regular cleaning to prevent the build-up of flammable creosote and soot. However, the narrow and often winding flue were too small for grown men to climb inside. So instead, the grim task fell to young children, some as young as 4 years old. These climbing boys, as they were called, were apprenticed to master sweeps and sent scrambling up into the dark, claustrophobic chimneys, brushing and scraping away the oily black soot as they went. It was a nightmarish existence for these small children. The work was hot, filthy, and exhausting. Climbing boys worked from dawn until dusk. Their small hands and knees scraped raw as they shimmied up and down the tight chimneys. Their eyes and lungs burned from the soot and ash, and their skin was often infected with painful sores. Many suffered respiratory illnesses like asthma and chimney sweep's carcinoma, a deadly form of cancer believed to be caused by exposure to chimney soot. Others developed skeletal deformities and stunted growth from contorting their growing bodies to fit in the narrow flue. Falling and getting stuck were also ever-present dangers. One of the most heart-wrenching stories of a climbing boy is that of George Brewster, a young London chimney sweep in the early 1800s. At just 11 years old, George was thin enough to fit inside the chimneys of Fulbourn Hospital, where he was sent to clean the flue. While climbing one of the chimneys, George became stuck, his arms pinned to his sides. He screamed for his master's help, but it was no use. Tragically, after 10 long hours trapped in the suffocating darkness, George's lifeless body was finally pulled from the chimney. He had died a slow and terrifying death, his last moments spent alone in the black prison of the chimney that had been his livelihood. An inquest later found that George had suffocated, his windpipe blocked by the soot and ash. Heartbreaking stories like George's eventually helped fuel a public outcry over the cruelties suffered by climbing boys. But change was slow. Many master sweeps resisted efforts to use long-handled brushes instead of child labor, viewing the lost apprenticeships as a threat to their livelihood. The powerful coal and gas industries also opposed reforms. Even after the practice was officially banned in 1840, some sweeps continued to illegally employ young climbing boys for decades. Still, brave individuals fought hard for climbing boys. One of the most famous was James Seawood, a former chimney sweep turned evangelist and social reformer. James himself had been apprenticed as a climbing boy at the tender age of 6 and barely survived the brutal conditions. Many years later, he recounted the horrors of his childhood to a parliamentary committee. "I have known children crippled by being crushed against the brickwork. I was locked up for days in a little room with no fire, very little food, and only soot for my bed." James's testimony, along with other harrowing stories and a growing public revulsion, eventually led to stricter enforcement of child labor laws. By the late 1800s, the use of climbing boys had finally died out, but not before untold thousands of small children were forced to sacrifice their health and too often their lives to the chimneys of Victorian England. As we've journeyed through the various dreadful occupations of the Victorian working class, a grim picture has emerged of the human toll of this age of progress and empire. The hardships and hazards endured by 19th century coal miners, textile workers, tanners, match girls, grave diggers, rat catchers, leech collectors, chimney sweeps, and so many others can be difficult for us to fathom from our modern vantage point. Though Victorian England saw many impressive advancements and achievements, these often came at a steep human cost borne by the most vulnerable. Impoverished children forced to toil in dark coal mines, young women slowly poisoned in match factories, small boys sent scrambling up chimneys to their deaths. Yet we also see the seeds of progress and reform taking root during this time. Labour movements to end child labour, unionisation efforts among miners and textile workers, the match girls' inspiring strike, new regulations on factories and apprenticeships. Slowly but surely, public outrage over the suffering of the Victorian poor grew and forced change. Of course, even today, worker exploitation and hazardous labour conditions have not been completely eradicated, with sweatshops, child labour, and lax safety protection still plaguing many industries globally. In that sense, the haunting lessons of the Victorian era remain all too relevant. But by remembering the lives and hardships of Victorian workers, not as sepia and abstract statistics, but as real individuals who struggled, suffered, and persevered, we connect ourselves to a powerful legacy of progress hard won by ordinary labourers. A chimney sweep, a trapper girl in a mine, a matchstick maker. Reflecting on their quiet courage in the face of adversity, we're reminded of the work still left to do to make their sacrifices not in vain. The worst jobs of Victorian England may be history, but the indomitable spirit of those who toiled in them endures, their lost voices and forgotten stories whispering to us still across the ages. As we drift off to sleep, perhaps we'll dream of them, all those long ago labourers who, through their struggle and solidarity, lit the way for the rights and dignities we're blessed with today, and which we must continue to expand and protect for generations of workers to come. The precarious work of a chimney sweep was not for the faint of heart. In the early days of the Victorian era, the job was often done by small children, some as young as 4 years old, who were sent up into the dark, narrow chimneys to clean out the soot and debris. These young workers, known as climbing boys, were often orphans or from impoverished families who had no other choice but to send their children into such dangerous work. The climbing boys would ascend the chimneys using their hands and feet to brace themselves against the sides. They carried a brush to sweep the soot loose and a scraper to chip away any hard deposits. It was a claustrophobic, filthy, and hazardous job. The chimneys were often still hot from the previous night's fires, and the boys could easily get burned or even stuck in the narrow flue. One of the most heart-wrenching stories of a climbing boy was that of George Brewster. In 1813, the 12-year-old Brewster was sent up the chimney of a Georgian townhouse in Portsmouth. However, the chimney narrowed unexpectedly, and poor George found himself trapped, unable to move up or down. His master, a sweep named Davis, tried in vain to free the boy, but to no avail. Tragically, George suffocated to death in that cramped space, his cries for help fading into silence. George Brewster's death sparked outrage and added momentum to the growing campaign to end the use of child sweeps. The cause was taken up by philanthropists like Jonas Hanway and William Tukey, who lobbied Parliament for reforms. However, it would still be many years before the practice was fully abolished. One former climbing boy who survived the trade and went on to advocate for change was James Seward. Born in 1813 in Norwich, Seward was sent up chimneys from the tender age of 5. He later described the horrors of the job, recalling how he would often draw blood at every pore from scraping against the rough brick. On one occasion, he narrowly escaped George Brewster's fate when he got stuck in a chimney and was only freed after his master broke open the fireplace. As an adult, Seward became a passionate campaigner for sweeps' rights. In 1834, he testified before Parliament about the cruelties of the trade, describing how boys were beaten, starved, and forced to work in dangerous conditions. His testimony helped lead to the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act of 1840, which prohibited the use of climbing boys under the age of 21. Despite the new law, the practice of using child sweeps persisted in some areas. Sweeps found ways to circumvent the rules, and the authorities often turned a blind eye. It would take further tragedies and the tireless efforts of reformers before the use of climbing boys was finally stamped out for good in the late 1800s. Today, the job of a chimney sweep looks very different. Modern sweeps use specialized brushes and vacuums to clean chimneys from the bottom up without the need to send anyone climbing inside. Yet, the dark history of the climbing boys remains a powerful reminder of the human costs of the Victorian age and the extreme inequality and exploitation that marked the era. As we reflect on the short, difficult lives of children like George Brewster and James Seward, it's important to remember that their suffering was not in vain. Their stories helped to expose the injustices of child labor and fueled the fight for better working conditions. While the Victorian era was in many ways an age of progress and achievement, it was also an age of great cruelty and hardship for the most vulnerable members of society. So let us spare a thought for the thousands of nameless climbing boys who risked their lives in the chimneys of England, and for the reformers who fought to end their plight. Their legacy is one of resilience, courage, and the eternal human yearning for justice and dignity in the face of adversity. As we bring our journey through the worst jobs of Victorian England to a close, it's clear that the era was one of stark contrasts and contradictions. On one hand, it was a time of tremendous growth, innovation, and prosperity. As the British Empire expanded and new technologies transformed the world, yet for the working classes, it was often an age of unrelenting misery, exploitation, and hardship. From the coal mines to the matchstick factories, from the tanneries to the chimneys, Victorian workers toiled in some of the most dangerous, unhealthy, and degrading conditions imaginable. Many, like the climbing boys, started work as mere children, their childhood sacrificed on the altar of industry and profit. Others, like the match girls and the leech collectors, faced toxic hazards and occupational diseases that left them scarred and broken. Yet even in the darkest corners of Victorian labour, there were glimmers of light and hope. There were brave reformers and activists who fought tirelessly to expose abuses and push for change, like Charles Booth and the leaders of the Match Earl strike. There were workers who banded together in unions and mutual aid societies, finding strength in solidarity and collective action. And there were the ordinary men, women, and children who endured the unendurable, who faced each day with grit and determination, and who managed to carve out moments of joy, love, and humanity in the harshest of circumstances. In their struggles and their triumphs, they left a legacy that echoes down to us today. For while the Victorian era may seem like a distant memory, its impact on our modern world is still felt in countless ways. The labor movements and reforms that began in the 19th century laid the groundwork for the worker protections and rights we enjoy today. The industries and technologies pioneered in Victorian times continue to shape our economy and our society. And the stories of the men and women who lived and worked in that age continue to inspire and educate us, reminding us of the indomitable human spirit and the ongoing fight for a more just and equitable world. So as we drift off to sleep, let us hold in our hearts the memory of the Victorian working class, the miners and the mill workers, the tanners and the grave diggers, the match girls and the climbing boys. Let us honor their sacrifices, learn from their struggles, and carry forward their dream of a world where no one is condemned to a life of misery and toil. In the grand sweep of history, their lives may seem small and forgotten, but they mattered then and they matter still. For in the end, the story of Victorian labour is not just a story of hardship and exploitation, but also one of resilience, courage, and the enduring power of the human spirit. It is a story that belongs to all of us, a reminder of how far we've come and how far we still have to go. So let us give thanks for the progress we've made, and let us resolve to keep fighting for a world where every worker is valued, protected, and empowered. Let us never forget the lessons of the past, even as we work to build a brighter future. And let us always remember the men and women who came before us, who toiled and struggled and dreamed of a better world, and who paved the way for us to make that dream a reality. Good night and sweet dreams. The nauseating job of leech collecting. In the dank, murky ponds and bogs of Victorian England, a group of unfortunate souls waded with purpose, their bare legs exposed to the dark waters. These were the leech collectors, a profession that was as unpleasant as it was necessary. In an era when bloodletting was considered a cure all for a variety of ailments, the demand for leeches was high, and so men, women, and even children found themselves employed in this nauseating trade. The job was simple in concept, but grueling in practice. Collectors would stand in the water, allowing the slimy worm-like creatures to attach themselves to their legs. They would then pluck the engorged leeches off one by one and place them in a container to be sold to apothecaries and hospitals. It was a slow, tedious process, and collectors often spent hours in the water, their skin pruning and their bodies shivering from the cold. But the physical discomfort was only part of the ordeal. Leeches, as you might imagine, are not the most pleasant creatures to have attached to one's body. Their bites, while not particularly painful, could be incredibly itchy and irritating. And then there was the blood loss. A single leech can consume up to 5 times its body weight in blood, and a collector might have dozens, if not hundreds, of the creatures feeding on them at once. Many collectors suffered from anemia and other health problems as a result of their work. Perhaps no one embodied the hardships of the leech collector more than Teresa Smith, a young woman from the bogs of Norfolk. Teresa began collecting leeches at the age of 12 to help support her family. Every day she would wade into the murky waters, allowing the leeches to latch onto her legs. She would collect between 500 and 600 leeches a day, a staggering number that left her weak and exhausted. But Teresa's struggles didn't end when she left the water. The constant exposure to the damp and cold left her with a persistent cough and frequent illnesses. And then there were the accidents. On more than one occasion, Teresa accidentally swallowed a leech while trying to remove it from her leg. The experience was as horrifying as it sounds, and she would spend hours retching and coughing, trying to dislodge the creature from her throat. Despite the hardships, Teresa and others like her continued to collect leeches day after day, year after year. They had little choice. In a time when poverty was rampant and employment opportunities were scarce, the nauseating job of leech collecting was often the only way to put food on the table. As unpleasant as it was, the work of leech collectors was an essential part of the Victorian medical landscape. Leeches were used to treat everything from headaches to hemorrhoids, and the demand for them was constant. Apothecaries and hospitals paid good money for healthy, well-fed leeches, and collectors could earn a decent wage if they were willing to put in the hours and endure the discomfort. But the job took a toll both physically and psychologically. Many collectors developed a deep aversion to the creatures they once relied on for their livelihood. Some reported nightmares in which they were covered in leeches, unable to escape their slimy grasp. Others simply couldn't bear the thought of ever setting foot in a pond or bog again. As the Victorian era drew to a close, so too did the heyday of the leech collector. Advances in medical understanding led to a decline in the use of bloodletting, and the demand for leeches began to wane. For the collectors, it was a bittersweet end to a difficult and unpleasant chapter in their lives. Today, the job of leech collecting is largely forgotten, a strange and unsettling footnote in the annals of Victorian history. But for those who lived through it, the memories of those long, cold hours in the water, the itching bites, and the constant fatigue will forever be etched in their minds. It was a job that few would envy, but one that played a small but significant role in the story of Victorian England. The precarious work of chimney sweeps. The image of the chimney sweep is a familiar one in Victorian literature and art. A small, soot-covered child clambering up into the dark, narrow confines of a chimney. But behind this romanticized image lies a grim reality. The life of a chimney sweep in Victorian England was one of hardship, danger, and all too often tragedy. In the early days of the Victorian era, chimneys were a vital part of every home, providing warmth and cooking facilities. But as coal became the primary fuel source, chimneys began to accumulate soot and ash at an alarming rate. If left unchecked, this buildup could lead to fires or even carbon monoxide poisoning. Enter the chimney sweep. The job of a chimney sweep was to climb into these narrow, often winding structures and scrape away the accumulated soot and ash. It was a job that required a small, agile body, and so it often fell to children, some as young as 4 or 5 years old. These climbing boys, as they were known, were apprenticed to master sweeps who were responsible for their training and welfare. But the welfare of these young workers was often a secondary concern. Chimney sweeping was a dirty, dangerous job, and many climbing boys suffered from a variety of health problems as a result of their work. The constant inhalation of soot and ash led to respiratory illnesses, while the awkward, cramped positions they were forced to adopt while climbing caused deformities and musculoskeletal problems. And then there were the accidents. Climbing boys were expected to scale chimneys that could be as narrow as 9 inches square, often with no safety equipment or support. Falls were common, and many boys suffered broken bones, head injuries, or worse. In some cases, boys became stuck in the narrow flue, unable to free themselves. If they were not rescued quickly, they could suffocate or burn to death. One of the most tragic cases of a climbing boy's death occurred in 18 1832 in the town of Oldham. A young sweep named George Brewster, just 11 years old, was sent up the chimney of a local textile mill. George became trapped in the flue, his arms pinned above his head. Despite the efforts of his master and other workers, George could not be freed. He remained stuck fast, screaming in terror for over 2 hours before finally suffocating to death. George's death caused a public outcry and led to calls for reform of the chimney sweeping trade. But change was slow to come. It wasn't until 1840 that a law was passed prohibiting the use of climbing boys under the age of 21. Even then, enforcement was lax and many sweeps continued to employ young children. One of the most vocal advocates for reform was a man named James Seward, himself a former climbing boy. Seward had survived the horrors of the trade and had gone on to become a successful businessman. But he never forgot the suffering he had endured or the plight of those still trapped in the chimneys. Seward wrote extensively about the need for reform and lobbied tirelessly for change. He invented a new type of brushing machine that could clean chimneys without the need for climbing boys and demonstrated its effectiveness before Parliament. Thanks in part to Seward's efforts, the use of climbing boys was finally outlawed in 1875, but for many the damage had already been done. Countless climbing boys had suffered and died in the chimneys of Victorian England, their short, brutal lives a testament to the cruelty and indifference of the age. Today the image of the chimney sweep is a quaint one, a reminder of a bygone era. But for those who lived and died in the trade, it was a symbol of hardship, suffering, and the very worst of Victorian working conditions. Conclusion. As we come to the end of our journey through the worst jobs of Victorian England, it's impossible not to feel a sense of sadness and horror at the hardships endured by so many. From the coal mines to the textile mills, from the tanneries to the chimneys, the working class of Victorian England toiled in conditions that were dirty, dangerous, and often deadly. But amidst the darkness there were glimmers of hope. The stories of reformers like Charles Booth and James Seward, who fought tirelessly to improve conditions for workers, remind us that even in the bleakest of times there were those who refused to accept the status quo. And the tales of ordinary workers like Elizabeth Burland and Patience Kershaw, who endured unimaginable hardships with grit and determination, serve as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As we look back on this period of history, it's easy to feel a sense of progress. The labour movements and reforms that emerged in the late Victorian era paved the way for the worker protections and rights we enjoy today, but it's important to remember that the fight for fair and safe working conditions is an ongoing one. Even now, in the 21st century, there are still those who toil in hazardous and exploitative conditions both in England and around the world. The stories of the Victorian working class serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of this fight. They remind us of the human cost of unchecked industrialization and the dangers of putting profits above people, and they challenge us to do better, to strive for a world in which no one is forced to endure the kind of suffering and hardship that was all too common in Victorian England. As we close our eyes and drift off to sleep, let us hold these stories in our hearts. Let us remember the bravery and sacrifice of those who came before us, and let us honor their memory by continuing the work of building a more just and equitable world. The worst jobs of Victorian England may be a thing of the past, but the lessons they teach us are as relevant today as they ever were. May we never forget them, and may they inspire us to fight for a better tomorrow. The putrid stench of the tanning pits was as constant as it was overwhelming. Even from afar, the noxious odor of soaking animal hides and caustic lime assaulted the senses. But for the wretched souls who toiled in the tannards day after day, there was no escaping the nauseating reek that clung to their clothes and seeped into their pores. The Victorian tanning industry was a filthy, grueling and hazardous trade. Transforming raw animal skins into usable leather was a long, multi-step process that involved beamhouse operations of soaking hides in baths of lime to remove hair and fat, tan yard work of steeping skins in acidic vats of tanning solution, and finishing processes of stretching, drying, and treating the leather. Each stage subjected workers to repulsive, unsanitary, and risky conditions. In the beam house, men stood for long hours raking animal hides in the lime pits, the corrosive alkali solution burning their skin and lungs. Cuts and scrapes from preparing the skins often became inflamed and infected. Respiratory diseases were common from breathing in the fetid fumes. Accidental drowning sometimes occurred when exhausted workers fell into the lime pits. The actual tanning process was no better. In the tan yards, hides were immersed for months in deep, uncovered vats containing ooze, a foul slurry of tanning acids often derived from tree bark or dog feces. Yard labourers constantly stirred and turned the heavy, slippery skins in the potent muck, the repetitive bending and lifting permanently warping their joints and spines. The stewing ooze emitted a methic stink and toxic gases. Many tanners developed severe skin ulcerations, lung diseases, cancers, and even literally drowned in the tanning solution. As one contemporary report described, that men can be induced to dive headforemost into such a villainous fake compound is a marvel of the power of habit. Perhaps no place epitomized the misery of Victorian tanning more than the slum of Bermondsey in southeast London, the epicenter of the British leather trade in the 1800s. There, hundreds of tanneries, skin mills and leather processes crammed together in a 1 square mile of pure squalor along the River Thames. The streets literally ran with blood, excrement and chemical runoff from the tan yards. Animal entrails, flesh, bones and hair clogged the roads and rotted in fetid heaps. The entire area was enveloped in a perpetual rancid haze. As author Thomas Mayhew wrote of Bermondsey in his expose London Labour and the London Poor, the whole place is redolent of tan. Skins, leather and tan in every stage of the manufacture hang, lie and are stacked everywhere. The kennels run with tan-coloured water. The air is so impregnated with tan that one not only smells it and tastes it, but one feels that one's clothes are saturated with it, and one's lungs breathe it. It's estimated that in the mid-1800s, Bermondsey eateries processed a staggering 1.2 million animal hides per year, over half of London's leather production. The scope of the industry there was as vast as the human suffering it entailed. Thousands of workers, many just children, face lives of unrelenting and inescapable misery in the tan yards and leather mills. Social researcher Charles Booth, known for his groundbreaking poverty maps of London, wrote harrowing descriptions of the wretched and intolerable circumstances he witnessed among Bermondsey's tannery workers in the 1890s. It is almost impossible to believe that men can be got to endure such conditions. The men employed are obviously of the lowest class, demoralized by their filthy surroundings. Fathers encourage their sons to follow them into the trade for the sake of the high wages that can be earned by a few hours' loathsome toil. Booth, while sometimes problematic in his moralizing conclusions, played an important role in documenting the abject poverty and grim working conditions prevalent in Victorian London's East End. His highly detailed study, Life and Labour of the People in London, published in multiple volumes in the 1890s, shed light on the plight of the working poor and argued for reforms. For the wretched tanners of Bermondsey and beyond, Booth's accounts helped raise awareness of the desperate need for change in the industry. Laws were slowly introduced in the late 1800s to curb the worst abuses like banning women and children from the tanards. But the fight for better, safer, and more dignified working conditions would stretch well into the 20th century. From coal mines to textile mills to tanneries, a common thread emerges when examining the worst jobs of Victorian England. The exploitation of the most vulnerable and the human toll of unfettered industrialization. The miseries and menaces workers faced in the foul-smelling tan yards were yet another example of profits prioritized over people and the dark underbelly of a rapidly modernizing society. But there were still more wretched trades that plagued the Victorian working class. If toiling amidst blood and excrement was the nadir, then laboring day after day with toxic chemicals had to be a close second. The match girls who manufactured matches and matchboxes were some of the most pitiful and imperiled workers in Victorian England. At its peak in the late 1800s, the British matchmaking industry employed thousands of women and girls, some as young as 5, in oppressive factories. They spent grueling 14-hour days handling white phosphorus, a highly poisonous substance used to make strike-anywhere matches. Match girls worked in cramped, poorly ventilated rooms, hunched over long tables, cutting and dipping matches by hand. The air hung heavy with phosphorus vapors that coated every surface with a sickly sweet residue. Many wore no protective gear, their skin and clothes gradually taking on an eerie glow from the chemical. But it was what match girls ingested that proved the most perilous. Starving on meager wages, some sought to quell their hunger by eating the scraps of bread they used to wipe excess phosphorus off the matches. Others absent-mindedly licked their phosphorus-crusted fingers. With every trace they swallowed, a diabolical poison built up in their bodies. The results were horrific. Prolonged exposure to white phosphorus caused a devastating condition known as FSI jaw. It began with aching teeth and bleeding gums. Soon the jawbone glowed a ghostly white and literally began to rot away. Gaping holes opened up in the cheeks, oozing pus and fragments of dying bone. The jaw weakened so much teeth fell out. In severe cases, entire sections of the face simply detached. Beyond the grotesque disfigurement, the phosphorus damaged the brain, lungs, and organs, leading to tremors, seizures, and an agonizing death, often by organ failure or suffocation from throat swelling. All told, FSY jaw inflicted a drawn-out demise of extreme pain and suffering, and there was little effective treatment beyond complete amputation of the jaw. It's estimated that up to 20% of Victorian matchgirls developed some stage of this awful ailment. Many continued working in lucifer matchstick factories, even as their jaws crumbled, because they desperately needed the paltry wages and had no other choice. Among those afflicted was Kate Slater, who began working as a match girl in London's East End at age 15 in 1885. Pretty and vivacious, Kate was a skilled matcher who could cut and dip thousands of sticks per day. But within a year she developed the telltale achy mouth and glowing jaw of phosphorus poisoning. As her condition worsened to the point she could barely eat or speak, Kate was fired from the match factory for being too sick to work. In a cruel irony, she and her family ended up having to sell matches on the street to survive. When a doctor who examined Kate urged her to quit, she reportedly replied, "If I don't work, I don't eat." Kate Slater's tragic story, while sadly common among match girls, helped put a human face on the suffering and galvanize a movement for change. In 1888, over 1,400 match girls at the Bryant and May match factory in London went on a historic strike to protest poor wages and deadly working conditions. Journalists like Annie Besant publicized the match girls' plight, and the public was outraged to learn of the cruelty, especially to children, occurring in the match industry. The story of FSY Jaw sparked widespread sympathy. With mounting pressure, Bryant May was forced to stop using white phosphorus and concede better pay and conditions to the strikers after 3 weeks. The match girls' victory was a watershed moment for workers and women's rights. It proved that even the lowliest labourers could challenge powerful interests and win with public support. And it added to the growing calls to ban white phosphorus matches on humanitarian grounds. But change would still prove slow and halting. Manufacturers resisted alternatives to the cheap but toxic chemical. It would take until 1906 for Britain to prohibit white phosphorus in matches. Even then, the law was riddled with loopholes. Some British match companies simply moved production to other countries with laxer regulations. It's a tragic pattern seen again and again in the worst jobs of the Victorian era. The scale of human misery and the glacial pace of reform. Industries that literally treated workers as disposable. A world where a teenage girl wasting away from FSI Jaw had no choice but to keep dipping matches in poison. The match girls, like the miners and the textile workers and the tanners, paid a horrific price for the luxuries and conveniences that Victorian society held dear. Every strike of a match, every flicker of flame belied the suffering of its maker. It's a poignant reminder of the darkness that long lurked and in many ways still does beneath the trappings of progress. But there were still more wretched fates that awaited the Victorian poor. Because if slowly poisoning yourself making matches was dreadful, then surely handling decaying bodies for a living had to be one of the grimmest jobs of all. In the crowded, filthy cities of Victorian England, death was a booming business. With disease and deprivation rampant, mortality rates were staggeringly high, especially among the working class. In the 1850s, London, a quarter of the population died before age 5. And the average life expectancy was just 27 years in the teeming slums. All those corpses had to go somewhere, and so emerged one of the most macabre yet essential trades of the time, the grave digger. With the demand for burial plots far outstripping the supply, grave digging in the Victorian era was literally a grave matter. For grave diggers, also known as sextons, the workday started before dawn. In the chilled mist of early morning, they trudged through winding paths of tombstones with shovels on their shoulders, kerosene lanterns lighting the way. Their task was a race against time and a test of brawn to dig as many 6-foot deep, 4-foot wide holes as possible before the day's funerals began. Digging was arduous manual labour. Victorian grave diggers plunged heavy iron spades into the earth over and over for hours on end. Rocks, roots and rubble slowed the toil. Inclement weather turned dirt to mud. Many grave diggers imbibed ale throughout the day to dull the aches and pains. He who digs the grave is often in it before he's done, went one Victorian ditty. But beyond the back-breaking labour, grave diggers faced more insidious hazards. Routinely handling dead bodies and working amidst rotting remains exposed them to all manner of diseases: cholera, typhus, tuberculosis, smallpox. A litany of lethal contagions lurked in the depths of cemeteries and churchyards. Disturbing the dead, sometimes quite literally, came back to haunt Victorian gravediggers. Digging in old burial grounds often meant unearthing bodies in varying states of decomposition. Skulls, bones, and bits of putrefied flesh surfaced with sickening regularity. In one grisly account, a gravedigger in a London cemetery struck a buried coffin, causing a most dreadful effluvium to waft out, knocking him and his fellow diggers unconscious. Inhaling miasmas from corpses was believed to be a direct route to contracting deadly ailments. But in truth, the concept of germs and sanitation was still in its infancy. Gravediggers often had no choice but to clamber over mouldering bodies, hacking through skeletons and sloughing through the fated organic ooze that collected at the bottom of graves. It was a recipe for infection and disease. And yet, as repugnant and risky as the work was, grave digging attracted many desperate labourers because of the relatively high wages it could bring. Experienced journeyman grave diggers in London could earn up to 6 shillings per grave in the mid-1800s, double what many factory workers made in a day. But there was a still darker side to the Victorian grave trade. In a time when the need for cadavers for medical dissection far outpaced the legal supply, some grave diggers supplemented their income by illicitly procuring corpses for doctors and anatomists. These so-called body snatchers or resurrection men stole freshly interred bodies, often to order for sale to medical schools. It was a grim business, to be sure. Body snatchers typically targeted the graves of the poor who lacked the means for deep burial or secure coffins. In the dead of night, teams of 2 or 3 men dug down to the head of a grave, broke open the coffin, and hoisted out the body with chains or ropes. The corpse was then secreted away to be haggled over by medical men by morning light. For their troubles, body snatchers could earn 10 to 14 times what a gravedigger made for an honest day's work. An adult corpse in good condition could fetch 8 to 10 in 1820s London, more than many labourers earned in 3 months. With those kinds of profits, it's little wonder that body snatching became rampant in the early 19th century. Perhaps no group of resurrection men achieved more infamy than the London Borough Gang, who sparked a scandal that upended the gravabbing trade in the 1830s. Led by a cunning undertaker named John Bishop, the gang innovated the practice of murder for dejection, luring victims to their deaths with the promise of alcohol, then selling the bodies to surgeons while they were still warm. Bishop and his accomplices were eventually caught in the act in 1831, when vigilant police discovered the gang in possession of a suspiciously fresh corpse in Bethnal Green. Under interrogation, Bishop confessed to multiple murders and the lucrative arrangement he had supplying the anatomy schools of King's College and London Hospital. The sensational case captivated the public and cast a harsh light on body snatching. The Borough Gang's trial and execution did help stem the tide of grave robbing, as did the Anatomy Act of 1832, which expanded the legal supply of medical cadavers. But the macabre misdeeds of the resurrection men had already taken a grim toll. Thousands of graves had been defiled, and an unknown number of people had been murdered, all to serve the needs of an advancing medical science. For the humble gravediggers who kept their shovels in the dirt, the spectre of the body snatchers was just one more haunting aspect of an already morbid profession. To be sure, there was a certain dark dignity in providing a fine and private place for the deceased, but there was no escaping the grim realities of the job, the filth, the stench, the desecration of the dead, Like so many of the worst Victorian trades, grave digging combined crushing labour with oppressive and often dangerous conditions, all for paltry pay and little recognition. It was a fate reserved for the poorest and most desperate, those willing to shoulder the weight of society's refuse, both literally and figuratively. As one Victorian writer put it, the sexton is a man apart even from his fellow labourers. His work is with the dead, and the taint of mortality clings to him like a shroud. For those who toiled in the graveyards and cemeteries of 19th century England, it was a taint that would never fully wash away. From the bowels of the earth to the vermin of the streets, the misery of Victorian labour knew no bounds. Because if digging graves was dismal, then surely hunting the teeming rats of England's cities was one of the foulest jobs of all. In the squalid, overcrowded slums of Victorian England, one creature reigned supreme: the rat. The brown rat, or sewer rat to be precise. This voracious, opportunistic rodent thrived in the fated streets and alleys of 19th century cities, feeding on the refuse and waste of human society. By some estimates, the rat population of London alone numbered in the tens of millions in the 1850s. They skewered through sewers and cesspools, swarmed butchers' awful piles, gnawed through the nauseating job of leech collecting. In the Victorian era, one of the most stomach-churning and skin-crawling jobs was that of the leech collector. During this time, bloodletting using leeches was a common medical practice, believed to cure all manner of ailments from headaches to hemorrhoids. The thinking was that by removing excess or bad blood, the body would be purified and returned to health. As misguided as it was, this theory created a booming demand for blood-sucking leeches, and intrepid collectors were more than willing to meet it, wading into murky ponds and streams and letting the slimy creatures latch onto their bare legs. Leech collecting was a job primarily done by women and children, especially in rural areas where income was scarce. They would don their oldest clothes, wade thigh-deep into infested waters, and wait patiently for the leeches to attach themselves. A skilled collector could gather hundreds of leeches a day, but it was far from easy money. The work was physically demanding, standing for hours in stagnant water, at risk of blood loss, infections, and even accidental leech ingestion if one wasn't careful. One of the most prolific leech collectors of the Victorian era was a woman named Teresa Smith. Born into poverty in Norfolk, England in 1804, Teresa turned to leech collecting as a young girl to help support her family. She would spend hours each day submerged in the dark pay bogs, letting the slimy annelids feed on her blood. On a good day, Teresa could collect an astonishing 500 to 600 leeches, which she would then sell to apothecaries and doctors in London. But Teresa's success came at a steep price. Years of daily blood loss left her chronically anemic and ill. Her skin bore the scars of countless leech bites, and she battled recurrent infections from the filthy water. Yet despite the toll it took on her health, Teresa continued collecting well into her 60s, driven by the need to earn a living. Her story reflects the harsh realities faced by many in the Victorian working class, who were forced to sacrifice their well-being for meagre wages. As grim as it was, leech collecting was a vital trade in Victorian times, with the slimy bloodsuckers in high demand. British hospitals were using over 20 million leeches a year by the 1830s. To keep up with the insatiable need, some suppliers even set up leech farms, breeding the creatures in specially constructed ponds. The industry was profitable but short-lived. By the late 1800s, advancements in medical knowledge began to discredit the practice of bloodletting, and the leech trade gradually dried up. Today, the use of leeches in medicine is largely confined to the history books, a curious relic of a bygone era. Yet, for the Victorian collectors who spent their days kneed in ponds, letting the creatures feast on their blood, it was a grim reality of life. Teresa Smith and her fellow collectors endured unimaginable hardships to eke out a living. Their sacrifice is a testament to the lengths some were forced to go to survive in a time when the divide between rich and poor was vast and unforgiving. As unpleasant as it is to imagine wading into leech-infested waters, let alone allowing the creatures to latch onto one's skin, it's important to remember that for many Victorians, this was not a choice but a necessity. The alternative was often starvation or the workhouse, fates that were arguably even worse than a few leech bites. In a society with no social safety net where the poor were largely left to fend for themselves, jobs like leech collecting were a means of survival no matter how distasteful or dangerous they might be. It's a sobering reminder of how far we've come in terms of workers' rights and protections, but also of the immense inequalities that still persist in our world today. While we may no longer have women and children collecting leeches for a living, there are still countless people around the globe who are forced to toil in hazardous and exploitative conditions simply to make ends meet. The story of the Victorian leech collectors may be a thing of the past, but the underlying issues of poverty and inequality that drove them to such desperate measures are very much still with us. So the next time you find yourself complaining about a bad day at work, spare a thought for Teresa Smith and her fellow leech collectors who endured unimaginable hardships just to put food on the table. Their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the indomitable resilience of the human spirit and the lengths we will go to in order to survive even in the face of the most daunting odds. The precarious work of chimney sweeps. In the Victorian era, the rapid growth of cities and the increasing use of coal for heating led to a proliferation of chimneys, and with them a demand for chimney sweeps. It was a dirty, dangerous job that fell mainly to young boys, some as young as 4 or 5 years old, who were small enough to climb into the narrow, twisting flue. These climbing boys, as they were known, would ascend the pitch-black chimneys, scraping away the soot and ash with their bare hands and crude brushes. The risks were manifold. The boys could easily get stuck or suffocate in the cramped, airless spaces. They inhaled soot and ash constantly, leading to respiratory illnesses and a particularly nasty form of cancer known as chimney sweeps. Carcinoma falls were common as the boys clambered up and down the precarious flue. And then there were the burns as they worked amidst the still hot embers and cinders. One of the most heart-wrenching cases was that of George Brewster, a young sweet boy from Suffolk, England. In 1875, at the age of 11, George was sent up the chimney of a large house in the nearby town of Fulbourn. He never came back down. The little boy had gotten stuck in a narrow bend of the flue, and despite desperate efforts to rescue him, he suffocated to death. His tragic end shocked the nation and added momentum to the growing campaign to end the use of child sweeps. One man who knew the perils of the trade all too well was James Seward. Born into poverty in London in 1814, James was sent up his first chimney at the tender age of 5. For the next 7 years, he endured the grueling, dangerous work until he finally managed to escape the life of a climbing boy. But the experience left an indelible mark on him. And as an adult, James became a fervent advocate for chimney sweep reforms. He testified before Parliament about the horrors he had witnessed and experienced, describing how the boys were forced to climb hot flue, their bare flesh seared by the soot and embers. He spoke of the beatings they would receive if they refused to ascend, and the long-term health effects of breathing in soot and ash day after day. James's powerful testimony helped to spur the passage of the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act of 1840, which prohibited the use of boys under the age of 21 for chimney sweeping. But change was slow to come. The law was poorly enforced, and many sweeps continued to employ young boys, arguing that they were indispensable for the work. It wasn't until further legislation in 1875, spurred in part by the outcry over George Brewster's death, that the use of climbing boys was finally abolished altogether. Even then, the transition to adult sweeps and mechanical cleaning methods was gradual, and it took years for the practice to die out completely. Today, the image of the soot-covered chimney sweep is a quaint, almost comical one, immortalized in works like the Disney film Mary Poppins. But for the real climbing boys of the Victorian era, there was nothing magical or jolly about their lot. They were the forgotten children sent into the darkness to do a man's work, their childhood sacrificed on the altar of industrial progress. As we reflect on their stories, it's important to remember that child labor is not just a thing of the past. Even now, millions of children around the world are engaged in hazardous, exploitative work, their health and futures jeopardized for the sake of cheap labor and easy profits. The chimney sweeps of Victorian England may be gone, but the underlying injustices that made their suffering possible are still very much with us. In remembering the likes of George Brewster and James Seward, we honor not just their individual struggles, but the struggles of all those who have been exploited and discarded in the name of progress. Their stories are a reminder of the human cost of unchecked industrialization and a call to vigilance in protecting the rights and well-being of workers, especially the most vulnerable among us. So, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for the climbing boys of old who toiled in the darkness so that others might enjoy the warmth and comfort of a well-maintained hearth. In their suffering and their strength, they embody the indomitable spirit of the working class and the ongoing fight for dignity and justice in the face of adversity. Conclusion. As we come to the end of our journey through some of the worst jobs of the Victorian era, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer scale of the hardships and horrors endured by the working class during this time, from the dark, dank coal mines to the sweltering textile mills. From the putrid tanneries to the pestilent graveyards, the men, women, and children of Victorian England toiled in conditions that are almost unimaginable to us today. We've heard the stories of Elizabeth Burland, the 8-year-old trapper girl who spent 14 hours a day in the darkness of the mines; of Kate Slater, the teenage matchstick maker who risked her health and her life for a meager wage; of Teresa Smith, who collected leeches with her own blood to keep her family from starving. These are not just historical anecdotes, but real lives, real people who suffered and struggled and endured against almost impossible odds. It's easy to look back on this period with a sense of detachment, to see it as a distant alien world far removed from our own. But the truth is, the legacy of the Victorian working class is still very much with us today. The labour movements, the reforms, the acts of resistance and solidarity that emerged from this crucible of suffering laid the groundwork for many of the rights and protections we now take for granted. Yet even as we acknowledge the progress that has been made, we must also recognise that the fight is far from over. Around the world, millions of workers still toil in conditions that are scarcely better than those of the Victorian era. They work long hours for little pay in hazardous, exploitative conditions. Their health and safety regularly put at risk. The names and faces may have changed, but the underlying injustices remain. So, as we reflect on the worst jobs of the Victorian era, let us do so not with a sense of morbid fascination, but with a spirit of empathy and solidarity. Let us remember the Elizabeth Burlens, the Kate Slaters, the Teresa Smiths, not as distant historical figures, but as our brothers and sisters in the eternal struggle for dignity and justice. In their stories, we find not just a record of suffering, but a testament to the resilience and courage of the human spirit. Against all odds, in the face of unimaginable adversity, the Victorian working class persevered. They fought, they organised, they demanded better, not just for themselves, but for the generations to come. Their legacy is one of hope and determination, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, change is possible. So as you drift off to sleep, let your dreams be not of the horrors of the past, but of the possibilities of the future. Let the stories of the Victorian workers be a source of inspiration and strength, a call to action in the ongoing fight for a world where no one is forced to sacrifice their health, their safety, or their dignity for the sake of a day's wage. In the end, the worst jobs of the Victorian era are not just a matter of historical curiosity, but a vital lesson for us all. They remind us of the indomitable spirit of the working class and the constant ongoing nature of the struggle for justice. They remind us that progress is possible, but it is never guaranteed that it must be fought for and won again and again by each successive generation. So let us honour the memory of those who came before us, those who toiled and suffered and fought for a better world. Let us take up their mantle and continue the work they began. For in the end, the struggle for dignity and justice is not just their story, but ours as well. A shared history that binds us all across the ages and across the world. Sleep well and dream of a better tomorrow, one that we can build together in the spirit of those who came before us and those who will come after. Good night. Certainly. Here is a continuation of the script for the worst jobs in the Victorian era. Boring history for sleep, the grim job of grave digging. While most people try to avoid the morbid realities of death, for some in Victorian Britain, dealing with the dead was a daily occupation. Grave digging was a grim but necessary trade, and one that played an important role in the era's dark underbelly. In the crowded cities of 19th century England, mortality rates were staggeringly high. Disease was rampant in the unsanitary conditions, and outbreaks of cholera, typhoid and smallpox frequently ravaged communities. Child mortality was especially tragic, with nearly half of all children failing to reach their 8th birthday. As a result, grave diggers were kept very busy trying to keep up with the constant need for new burial plots. It was a physically demanding job, requiring long hours of digging in all weather conditions. The work was often done at night or in the early morning hours to avoid prying eyes, and to have the graves ready for the next day's funerals. Gravediggers used crude tools like spades, shovels, and picks to break through the hard ground and carve out 6 feet of earth. Aside from the backbreaking labor, grave digging posed plenty of other hazards and hardships. Prolonged exposure to decaying remains put the diggers at risk of contracting diseases themselves. Tuberculosis, which ran rampant in Victorian England, could be contracted from the exhumed remains of those who had succumbed to consumption. Protecting oneself against miasmas or foul vapors thought to emanate from corpses was a constant concern. The work also took a psychological toll, with grave diggers forced to regularly confront the realities of death and witness the grief of mourers. Many took to the bottle to cope with the emotional strain and long hours, further contributing to their reputation as a coarse and unrefined bunch. Perhaps the most famous Victorian gravedigger of all was one Mr. Sexton. In 1875, he gave a scandalous interview to a London newspaper where he jovially recounted his over 2 decades spent burying London's dead. Ston claimed to have dug over 15,000 graves in his career and regaled the shocked reporter with tales of buried treasure, amorous encounters in cemeteries, and the tricks of the trade. His cavalier attitude in the face of so much tragedy made him something of a notorious figure in Victorian society. But the gravediggers were not the only ones getting their hands dirty in the funeral trade. In the early 19th century, a serious shortage of cadavers for medical dissection led to the rise of the body-snatching trade. Enterprising thieves known as resurrectionists would dig up freshly interred bodies and sell them to anatomists for a handsome fee. The most notorious resurrectionists of the era were London's Burke and Hare, who went a step further and murdered at least 16 people in order to sell their bodies to doctors. Their crimes were discovered in 1828 and caused a national scandal. In response, Parliament quickly passed the Anatomy Act, which expanded the legal supply of medical cadavers beyond the bodies of executed criminals, effectively putting the resurrectionists out of business. For the grave diggers who had to deal with the aftermath of the body-snatching epidemic, it meant taking extreme measures to ensure the dead remained undisturbed. Heavy metal grates and stone slabs, known as mort safes, were placed over graves, while some cemeteries hired armed guards to patrol the grounds at night. At one point, even exploding coffins were developed as a drastic deterrent against would-be grave robbers. As the 19th century progressed, changing attitudes around death and burial would transform the grave-digging trade. The Victorian obsession with the beautification of death saw the rise of the garden cemetery movement, which sought to reimagine graveyards as tranquil, pastoral places of contemplation. Burial grounds were redesigned into beautiful landscaped parks full of elegant headstones and memorials. For gravediggers, this meant a slightly less macabre working environment, digging graves amidst lovely flowers, trees, and sculptures instead of the bleak, barren graveyards of the past. But it did little to change the fundamental nature of the job, one that would always be defined by long hours, hard labor, and an uncomfortable proximity to death. So when you ponder the world of Victorian mourning, spare a thought for the humble gravedigger toiling away in the shadows to provide a final resting place for rich and poor alike. Their thankless job reminds us that even in an age of prim propriety and soaring progress, there was always a need for someone to do the dreary, dirty work of death, the dreadful work of rat-catching. Another unpleasant but vital job in Victorian times was that of the rat-catcher. As long as humans have lived in dense cities, rats have been an unwelcome presence, feeding on waste and spreading disease. But in the teeming metropolises of industrial Britain, the rodent problem reached epic proportions. A single pair of rats can produce up to 200 offspring in a year. And with abundant food and hiding places in the heaps of urban refuse, their numbers exploded. By some estimates, the rat population in Victorian London outnumbered the human one, with tens of millions of the creatures infesting cellars, sewers, and granaries. To combat this revolting rat epidemic, an entire profession emerged, that of the rat catcher. Rat catchers were hardy souls employed by local authorities or hired privately by businesses and homeowners to wage war on the furry hordes. The primary tools of their trade were specially bred dogs, usually terriers, trained to sniff out and dispatch rats with ruthless efficiency. The rat catcher would block off rat holes and escape routes, then set his dogs loose to catch and kill the fleeing rodents. A good ratting dog could slaughter hundreds of rats in a single day. But of course it was not a job for the faint of heart. Rat catchers frequently suffered bites from their frenzied quarry, which could lead to nasty infections and even ray-torn illnesses like typhus or rabies. The risk of disease was especially high given the filthy environments in which they plied their trade, rummaging through sewers and trash heaps. Poisons like arsenic were also used to cull rat populations, but these could be indiscriminate killers, inadvertently harming other animals or even children who might mistake the toxic bait for food. In 1911, a rat catcher in Paddington accidentally poisoned over 100 people when arsenic-laced fish heads he had set out for rats ended up in the local market's fish supply. Beyond the risks and hardships, rat catching was a competitive trade that required both skill and a bit of showmanship to stand out. The most famous rat catcher of the Victorian era was Jack Black, appointed as Queen Victoria's official rat catcher in 1863. Black was renowned for his flamboyant attire, wearing a patchwork suit adorned with rat tails and a belt inset with cast iron rats. He bred the finest ratting dogs and wasn't shy about advertising his services, handing out business cards boasting his royal seal of approval. In his heyday, he reportedly caught more than 500 rats a month at Buckingham Palace alone. When he wasn't ridding the royal residence of rodents, Black could often be found plying his trade in one of Victorian London's many rat pits. These were seedy establishments where punters would bet on how many rats a dog could kill in a certain amount of time. A celebrated ratting dog named Billy once killed 100 rats in just 5.5 minutes, or about one rat every 3 seconds. The festering rat pits, where dozens of rats would be crammed into a confined space and set upon by frenzied dogs, were a disturbing form of entertainment that reflected the callous attitudes towards animal welfare at the time. For impoverished rat catchers, however, the prize money offered by such events could mean the difference between putting food on the table or going hungry. As the Victorian era progressed, rat catching began to evolve from a brute force approach to one that emphasized prevention and scientific understanding. The development of stronger, more targeted rat poisons and the emergence of the field of epidemiology began to provide new tools for combating rodent infestations. In 1900, the government official Sir George Buchanan conducted a groundbreaking study that identified rats as the carriers of plague, leading to more stringent efforts to eradicate them as a matter of public health. This marked a turning point in the battle against rats, as the focus shifted from simply killing them to controlling their populations through sanitation and other preventive measures. But even as the science advanced, the day-to-day drudgery of the rat catcher remained much the same. It was a dirty, dangerous and low-paying job that put its practitioners on the front lines of the eternal war between humans and their unwanted vermin neighbors. So the next time you see a rat scurry across your path, spare a thought for the Victorian rat catcher and the thankless work they did to keep the rodent hordes at bay. In a society where so many lived in squalor, it was the rat catcher who waged the battle against squalor itself, one rat at a time, the nauseating job of leech collecting. By the time Queen Victoria ascended the throne in 1837, leeches were a prized commodity in the world of medicine. In the era of so-called heroic medicine, bloodletting was a standard medical treatment for everything from headaches to fevers to gout. And there was no better agent for draining blood than the humble leech. Leeches are segmented worms that feed on the blood of animals. They are equipped with 3 sharp jaws that slice into the skin, allowing them to draw out blood while secreting a natural anesthetic and anticoagulant to keep the blood flowing. A single leech can consume up to 5 times its body weight in blood in one feeding. As the popularity of bloodletting grew, so did demand for leeches, giving rise to a booming leech trade. Millions of leeches were needed each year to stock the cupboards of doctors and apothecaries, and the job of leech collector emerged to meet that demand. Most leech collectors were women and children from impoverished rural areas who would wade into ponds, marshes and streams to gather the bloodsuckers. They would often stand still in the water for hours, allowing the leeches to attach to their bare legs and feet. It was a grueling and nauseating job, to say the least. The sensation of dozens of slimy creatures latching onto one's skin and gorging themselves on blood was understandably unpleasant. Leech bites could be painful and itchy, and excessive blood loss from multiple bites was a real concern. There were also the hazards of the environments in which leech collectors worked. Waiting in stagnant water and swampy areas exposed them to waterborne diseases like dysentery and typhoid. Venomous snakes and other creatures lurking in the murky depths posed additional risks. One of the most prolific leech collectors of the Victorian era was a woman named Teresa Smith. In the mid-1800s, she was known as the Leech Queen of Norfolk, supplying leeches to hospitals and pharmacies across England. Smith would spend up to 12 hours a day standing thigh-deep in the Norfolk Broads, a network of rivers and lakes in eastern England. She had an uncanny ability to find the best spots for leeches and could collect up to 600 in a single day. Her secret, she claimed, was a special potion she would rub on her legs to attract the leeches. Despite the hardships of the job, leech collectors could make a decent living if they were skilled and hard work. Leeches were typically sold to dealers for a penny or 2 each, and a good collector could gather several hundred per day. In the 1830s, when the leech trade was at its peak, a full-time leech collector could earn more than 30 shillings a week, a respectable wage for the time. But the golden age of leech collecting would not last forever. As the 19th century progressed, advances in medical knowledge led doctors to question the efficacy of bloodletting. The development of new drugs and treatments began to replace leeches in the physician's toolkit. By the 1860s, the demand for leeches had declined sharply, and many leech collectors found themselves out of work. Some turned to other forms of scavenging, such as gathering watercress or wild herbs to make ends meet. Others simply faded into obscurity, their backbreaking labor no longer required by the march of progress. Today, leech therapy is making a minor comeback as a niche treatment for conditions like arthritis and circulation disorders. But the days of armies of leech collectors wading into the marshes are long gone, a relic of a bygone era when medicine was a much more brutal and visceral affair. So next time you shudder at the thought of a slimy leech attaching itself to your skin, remember the hard-working leech collectors of Victorian Britain who endured that revulsion on a daily basis to supply the demands of a bloodthirsty medical establishment. Theirs was a thankless job, but one that played a small but significant role in the history of medicine: the precarious work of chimney sweeps. In the early decades of the Victorian era, child labour was a harsh fact of life for many families. With industrialisation driving down wages and living standards, parents often had to send their children to work to help make ends meet. And few jobs were more synonymous with the exploitation of children than that of the chimney sweep. In the days before central heating, most homes were heated by coal fires, and chimneys needed to be regularly cleaned to prevent the build-up of soot and the risk of fire. This was the job of the chimney sweep, who would climb up into the narrow, winding flue to scrape out the accumulated soot and ash. The problem was that most chimneys were too narrow for an adult to climb, so the job fell to small children, usually boys between the ages of 5 and 10. These climbing boys were apprenticed to master sweeps who were supposed to provide them with food, lodging, and a basic education in exchange for their labor. In reality, the life of a climbing boy was one of unrelenting misery and hardship. They were often malnourished and poorly clothed, shivering in the pre-dawn cold as they set off to clean their first chimney of the day. The work itself was filthy and dangerous, with the boys forced to scramble up pitch black, suffocating chimneys using their knees and elbows. The constant inhalation of soot and ash led to a host of respiratory ailments, including a painful and often fatal condition known as chimney sweep's carcinoma. This was a form of cancer caused by the irritation of the scrotum by soot particles, and it could strike boys as young as their early teens. There were also the ever-present dangers of getting stuck or injured in the cramped, twisting confines of a chimney. Boys would often get wedged in tight spots and have to be pulled out by their ankles, resulting in bruises, scrapes, and sometimes broken bones. Falls were another hazard, with many boys suffering crippling or even fatal injuries from tumbling out of a chimney onto a hard floor below. Perhaps the most heartbreaking story of a climbing boy gone wrong is that of George Brewster. In 1813, the 14-year-old apprentice got stuck in a narrow chimney in Cambridge and suffocated to death before he could be freed. His master had lit a fire to encourage him to climb faster, filling the flue with smoke and causing the boy to lose consciousness. It took 13 hours to dismantle the chimney and remove his lifeless body. Brewster's tragic tale helped to galvanize public opinion against the use of climbing boys, and the first parliamentary inquiry into the practice was launched later that year. But it would take decades of campaigning and legislative wrangling before the use of climbing boys was finally banned in 1875. One of the most prominent advocates for chimney sweep reform was a man named James Seawood. Seawood had been a climbing boy himself in the early 1800s and had first-hand experience of the brutality and exploitation of the trade. As an adult, he became a master sweep and used his position to lobby for better working conditions and regulations. He invented a new type of brush that could be used to clean chimneys from below, reducing the need for climbing boys. He also spoke out against the use of soot pills, a cruel practice where masters would force feed boys pills made of soot and mud to stunt their growth and keep them small enough to fit in chimneys. Seward's efforts, along with those of other reformers like the Earl of Shaftesbury, helped to slowly chip away at the institution of child chimney sweeps. But change was slow in coming, and many climbing boys continued to suffer in silence, their plight unseen and unheard by a society that relied on their labor but cared little for their welfare. Today, the image of the soot-covered chimney sweep is a quaint relic of a bygone age, more likely to be seen in a Mary Poppins movie than in real life. But for generations of Victorian children, it was a grim and all too real fate, one that robbed them of their health, their childhood, and sometimes even their lives. So the next time you enjoy the warmth and comfort of a cozy fire, spare her the nauseating job of leech collecting. Imagine, if you will, wading waist-deep into a murky, stagnant pond, feeling slimy creatures slithering against your bare legs, attaching themselves to your skin and slowly sucking away your blood. Such was the nauseating daily reality for Victorian leech collectors, a job that was as unpleasant as it was surprisingly common in 19th century Britain. You see, leeches were widely used for bloodletting treatments by doctors of the era. Bloodletting was seen as a cure-all prescribed for everything from headaches to fever to mental illness. The thinking was that draining bad blood from the body would restore balance and health. Of course, we know now that this practice had no real medical benefit and in fact often made patients even sicker. But at the time, the demand for medicinal leeches was insatiable. Enter the leech collectors, a hardy group of souls, often women and children from poor families, who would gather these blood-sucking worms from ponds, streams and marshes to sell to apothecaries and hospitals. The job was simple in concept but grueling in practice. Collectors would stand in the stagnant water, letting the leeches attach to their legs. Once the leeches had their fill of blood, the collectors would pluck them off, store them in jars or baskets, and head to market. The hazards of this work were many. Prolonged submersion in dirty water led to all manner of infections and illnesses. Collectors risked blood loss, anemia, and accidental leech ingestion if one were to wriggle its way into the mouth or nose. There are accounts of collectors fainting from weakness after a long day's work, and even reports of some bleeding to death from leech bites that wouldn't clot. One of the most prolific leech collectors of the Victorian age was a woman named Teresa Smith. Teresa lived a hard life in the boggy marshlands of Norfolk, England. Every day she would wade into the murky waters and allow hundreds of leeches to feed on her legs and feet. On a good day, Teresa could gather 500 to 600 leeches, an astounding harvest, but a hell of a toll on the body. Despite the hardships, Teresa and collectors like her had little choice but to pursue this nauseating trade. Leeches fetched good money at market. Sometimes a day's collection could earn what a labourer made in a week. For many poor families, leech collecting was the only way to scrape by. As unpleasant as the work was, it did give women like Teresa a degree of financial independence that was rare for the time. Leech collecting was one of the few trades where women could earn their own income without relying on a husband or father. For some, it was a grim kind of empowerment. The leech trade finally began to decline in the late 1800s as the practice of bloodletting fell out of medical fashion. Some historians credit the pioneering work of French microbiologist Louis Pasteur, whose germ theory helped convince doctors that balance of the body's humours had little to do with disease. Others point to the rise of alternative treatments and homeopathy. Whatever the cause, as the medicinal leech market contracted, so too did the unpleasant business of leech collecting. It was the end of an era, and while few likely mourned the passing of this nauseating trade, it's worth reflecting on the women and children who endured such grim conditions to make a meagre living. In many ways, the story of the Victorian leech collectors is a microcosm of the plight of the working poor in 19th century Britain, a tale of back-breaking labour, bodily suffering, and the daily struggle to survive in an unforgiving world. It's a chapter in history that is as fascinating as it is sobering. So the next time you find yourself complaining about a long day at the office or a frustrating Zoom call, spare a thought for Teresa Smith and her legions of leech collecting compatriots who day after day waded into stagnant ponds to let wriggling parasites feast on their blood, all to earn a crust of bread. Suddenly our modern working woes don't seem quite so dire in comparison. The precarious work of chimney sweeps, soot, grime, darkness, claustrophobia. These words only begin to describe the grim working conditions of one of the most iconic and precarious jobs of the Victorian era, the chimney sweep. In the early days of the Industrial Revolution, Britain was powered by coal, which meant that nearly every home had coal-burning fireplaces, and those chimneys needed regular cleaning to prevent toxic build-up and fires. But the twisting, narrow flue of Victorian chimneys were often too small for grown men to climb, and so the sweeps turned to a cruel solution. Using small children, usually boys between the ages of 5 and 10, as climbing boys to shimmy up the flue and dislodge the soot with brushes and scrapers. These climbing boys, also poignantly known as blackjacks for the soot that perpetually covered their skin, led short, miserable lives of hardship and abuse. Many were orphans sold by workhouses to sweeps for a few pounds. Others were indentured servants bound to their masters for 7-year contracts. Nearly all were malnourished, overworked, and regularly beaten. The job itself was a nightmare. Boys would be sent up still hot chimneys, their bare feet and knees scraped raw against the jagged brick as they climbed. They breathed in thick, black soot which coated their lungs and left them prone to respiratory illnesses. Many developed deformities of the spine and joints from contorting their growing bodies to fit in the narrow flue. It was not uncommon for climbing boys to get stuck in chimneys and suffocate to death. The tragic tale of George Brewster is a heart-wrenching example of the risks these child sweeps faced. In 1818, 11-year-old George was sent by his master, William Wire, to clean the chimneys at Fulbourn Hospital in Cambridge. George got stuck in one of the narrow flue, and his attempts to free himself only wedged him in tighter. For 5 long hours, rescuers chipped away at the brick. But by the time they reached George's soot-covered body, he had suffocated. George's case caused a public outcry, but child sweeps continued to die in chimneys with grim regularity. It's estimated that in just one decade of the early 1800s, over 20,000 climbing boys perished on the job. The actual numbers were likely much higher, as many deaths went unreported by sweeps who feared repercussions. Despite the dangers, Victorian society was slow to combat the abuses of the child chimney sweeps. The prevailing attitude was that soot-covered climbing boys were a necessary evil in a coal-powered world. Some even romanticized the practice. Books and illustrations of the time often depicted cheerful, rosy-cheeked sweeps, a far cry from their grim reality. However, thanks to the tireless work of activists and reformers, change slowly but surely came for the climbing boys. One of the most vocal advocates was a man named James Seawood himself, a former child sweep. Seawood had survived the chimneys and made it his life's mission to end the cruelties of the trade. He wrote impassioned letters, gave speeches, and lobbied Parliament for new laws to protect climbing boys. In 1840, the Chimney Sweeps Act finally prohibited the use of boys under the age of 21 for climbing chimneys. But like many Victorian reforms, the law was poorly enforced and largely ignored by sweeps who had no other way to clean the flue. It would take several more decades and advancements in brushes and cleaning methods before the era of the climbing boys finally came to a close. Today, the chimney sweep is a quaint symbol of Old England, memorialized in sentimental poems and songs. But the real history is far darker. A tale of tiny soot-covered boys sent to their deaths in airless chimneys, all for the crime of being born poor in a merciless age. As we cozy up to our modern, well-cleaned fireplaces, let us remember the climbing boys and the precarious lives they led. In many ways, their suffering paved the way for the workplace protections we take for granted today. May we never forget their story. Conclusion. As we've journeyed through the grim and gritty world of Victorian labour, a few common threads have emerged. We've seen how the rapid industrialization and unchecked capitalism of 19th century Britain created an economy that ran on the broken backs of the working poor. We've witnessed how the most dangerous, dirty, and degrading jobs often fell to society's most vulnerable, women, children, the destitute, and the desperate. And we've heard harrowing tales of individual workers who faced unimaginable hardships in the name of earning a meagre wage. From the coal pits to the match factories, the tanneries to the leach ponds, the lives of Victorian labourers were defined by long hours, hazardous conditions, and an oppressive lack of dignity or safety. Injuries, illnesses, and even death on the job were shockingly commonplace. And yet for many, enduring these grim realities was the only path to survival in a world with no social safety net. But amidst all the darkness, we've also seen glimmers of hope and resilience. We've met brave reformers and activists who fought tirelessly to shine a light on workplace abuses and agitate for change. We've heard the stories of workers who banded together in unions and mutual aid societies to demand better treatment. And slowly but surely, we've traced the hard-won progress of labour laws and regulations to protect the health and welfare of workers. Of course, the struggle for workers' rights didn't end with the Victorians. Even today, in our globalized economy, there are still those who toil in conditions not so far removed from the horrors of the 19th century. Sweatshops, child labour, and workplace safety violations persist in many corners of the world, and so the lessons of history remain as vital and relevant as ever. But as we reflect on the lives and labours of these long-ago workers, perhaps the most important thing is simply to remember. To pause in our busy modern lives and acknowledge the sacrifices of generations past. To honour the suffering they endured and the progress they pushed forward. And to renew our commitment to building a world where no one has to risk their health, their dignity, or their life, all for the sake of a day's wage. So let us never forget the matchstick girls and their beef-side jaws, the chimney sweeps and their soot-blackened lungs, the leech collectors and their blood-drained bodies. Let us hold their stories close and let their struggles fuel our own fights for a fairer, safer, and more just society. And in the meantime, as we drift off to sleep, let us dream of a world where all work has dignity, where all labourers are valued, and where no job is a nightmare. For that would be the most fitting tribute of all to the workers who came before us, and whose suffering paved the way for the rights and protections we enjoy today. May they rest in power, and may their legacies live on. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the worst jobs of Victorian Britain. Good night and sweet dreams. As we've seen, the life of a leech collector was far from easy. Waiting day after day in murky leech-infested ponds and streams, it was a job that took a heavy toll on the health and well-being of those desperate enough to take it on. But if you thought standing around waiting to be eaten alive by blood-sucking worms was bad, wait until you hear about the plight of the Victorian chimney sweep. This was a job that quite literally thrust small children into the direst of circumstances. In the early 1800s, chimneys were the lungs of England's bustling cities. Every building had multiple flue, belching out the exhaust of coal-burning fireplaces and stoves, but all that soot built up over time, clogging the narrow chimney flue and becoming a dangerous fire hazard. Enter the chimney sweeps. For a few meagre shillings, these soot-covered tradesmen would come knock on your door and offer to scrape the grime out of your chimney. But as you might imagine, shimmying up a narrow, pitch-black passage filled with toxic soot was not a task for the faint of heart or the fully grown, and that's where the climbing boys came in. The climbing boys, some as young as 4 or 5 years old, were the real heroes and victims of the chimney-sweeping trade. These small, nimble children were the only ones who could fit inside the narrow, twisting flue, purchased from destitute parents or plucked right off the street by opportunistic chimney sweeps. They were forced to climb up into the claustrophobic darkness, scraping and scrubbing with handheld brushes as they went. It was a perilous and frightening existence for these young climbers. The work was hard and the hours were long. A full day's work could mean climbing up a dozen or more chimneys, and you wouldn't return home until your master had emptied his soot sack. You quickly learned to always keep one hand over your mouth, lest you breathe in a lung full of the thick, oily soot that coated the chimney walls. But even then, the particles would find their way into your nose, your eyes, down your throat, under your fingernails. Many climbing boys developed respiratory ailments like the dreaded chimney sweep's cough and other chronic breathing problems. Bruises, broken bones, and head injuries from falls were commonplace. And then there was the constant terror of getting stuck, wedged hopelessly inside a sweltering, suffocating chamber of brick and mortar. It was the nightmare of every climbing boy. Most would be fortunate enough to escape with their lives, albeit with a few new scars to show for the ordeal, but some were not so lucky. Such was the tragic fate of young George Brewster, a spry 11-year-old who took up chimney climbing to help support his widowed mother. In 1818, George was sent by his master to clean the chimney of an opulent estate in Southampton. It was a particularly tricky chimney with several sharp angles, but George dutifully climbed up into the darkness as he had done countless times before. Several hours passed and little George failed to reappear. Increasingly frantic calls of sweep from his master went unanswered. Finally realizing the horrible truth, the master summoned rescuers to break open the chimney brick by brick to extract the boy. By the time they pulled his soot-covered body out, George Brewster had been dead for hours, wedged tightly into a corner of the flue. An inquest later determined he had become stuck and suffocated on his own body weight. Unable to draw breath with his knees pressed up against his chest, he was buried a pauper with the epithet, "I was only a climbing boy." Tragedies like the death of George Brewster were all too common in the heyday of chimney climbing, but they helped fuel a growing movement to put an end to the grim practice. Prominent Victorians like Charles Dickens and Lord Shaftesbury railed against the exploitation of climbing boys, and the Chimney Sweepers and Chimneys Regulation Act of 1840 made it illegal to send children up chimneys. Even so, it took several more decades before the law was widely enforced, and the era of climbing boys finally came to an end. By that time, thousands of children had been sacrificed to the ruthless practice, their lungs blackened and their bodies broken in the name of profit. One of the rare climbing boys who survived the ordeal to adulthood was a man named James Seawood. Born into grinding poverty in 1813, James was sold by his family into the chimney trade at the tender age of 6. For the next 10 years of his life, he lived the brutal, filthy existence of a climbing boy, rising before dawn, working into the night, subsisting on little more than a crust of bread and a few hours' sleep. His childhood was lost to the chimneys. But against all odds, James endured the horrors of his trade and eventually achieved his freedom. In his later years, he would go on to become one of Victorian England's most eloquent voices decrying the evils of child chimney climbing. His vivid first-hand testimonies helped turn the tide of public opinion against the practice. Looking back from the comfortable remove of the 21st century, it can be hard to fathom the kind of society that would consign its most vulnerable members to such a hellish existence. But in the context of the Victorian era, chimney climbing was just one of the many everyday atrocities visited upon the working poor in the name of commerce and convenience. It's a sobering reminder of the human costs of unchecked industrial capitalism and the depths of suffering that can be inflicted when greed is allowed to trample human dignity. The story of the climbing boys may be a dark chapter in our history, but it's one we forget at our peril as we reflect on the plight of the chimney climbers and the other wretched souls we've encountered on our journey through the worst jobs of Victorian England. It's worth pausing to consider how far we've come and how far we still have to go. In the century and a half since the heyday of the climbing boys, child labour laws, workplace safety regulations, and the rise of unionisation have undoubtedly made life immeasurably better for the working class. No longer do we send children to toil in the bowels of the earth or climb into burning chimneys. The days of 16-hour shifts, paupers' graves, and FSI jaw are mercifully behind us. And yet the exploitation of workers in the name of profit is hardly a thing of the past. In far too many corners of the world, men, women, and yes, even children, still toil in conditions scarcely better than those of Victorian England. From the sweatshops of Bangladesh to the mines of the Congo, the spectre of unchecked capitalism still looms large. But perhaps by studying the lives of those who came before us, the matchstick girls and miners, the grave diggers and chimney climbers, we can learn to build a society that truly values human life over the bottom line. A society where a hard day's work is rewarded with dignity, not degradation. Where the wealth generated by the labours of the many is not hoarded by the few. It's a tall order, to be sure, But as the old saying goes, those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Let us hope that by remembering the hard lessons of the Victorian era, we can avoid condemning future generations to the same fate. And so as we close the book on our tour of the worst jobs of Victorian England, let us spare a thought for the men, women, and children who toiled and suffered in the dark corners of an empire. May their sacrifices not be in vain, and may their memories spur us on to build a better, brighter future for all. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the darkest days of industrial Britain. Until next time, this is your faithful historian signing off. The grim job of grave digging. In the crowded, disease-ridden cities of Victorian England, mortality rates were tragically high. Burials happened daily, and the demand for grave diggers was constant. These men, and sometimes women, worked long hours in wretched conditions, surrounded by death and decay. Their job was not only physically taxing, but emotionally and psychologically draining as well. Grave diggers, also known as secs, were responsible for digging the graves, often by hand with just a shovel and pickaxe. It was back-breaking work, especially in the cold winter months when the ground was frozen solid. They toiled from dawn to dusk, carving out 6 feet of earth for each new, eternal resident of the cemetery. Blisters, calluses, and aching muscles were par for the course. But the physical labor was not the worst part of the job. Gravediggers were constantly exposed to decomposing corpses and the associated health hazards. In an era before germ theory was widely accepted, they didn't understand the risks they faced. The stench of rotting flesh hung heavy in the air as they went about their work. Diseases like typhus, cholera, and smallpox could easily spread from the dead to the living. Many gravediggers met their own untimely ends from the illnesses they contracted on the job. Perhaps even more unnerving was the fact that some gravediggers supplemented their income by selling cadavers to medical schools for anatomy lessons and dissection. Before the Anatomy Act of 1832, the only legal source of corpses for medical research was the bodies of executed criminals, which were in short supply. This led to a brisk trade in illicitly obtained bodies fresh from the graveyards. The resurrection men, as they were called, were the stuff of macabre legend in Victorian England. In the dead of night, these grave robbers would creep into cemeteries, dig up recently buried bodies and sell them to the highest bidder. Some of the more entrepreneurial ones even went so far as to murder people to sell their corpses. The most notorious case was that of William Burke and William Hare, who killed at least 16 people in Edinburgh and sold their bodies to a local anatomy school. While not all grave diggers resorted to such ghoulish extremes, the association with body snatching cast a dark shadow over the profession. For many, grave digging was a last resort, a job taken out of sheer desperation when no other work could be found. It was a lonely, isolating occupation, with grave diggers often ostracized by the rest of society. They were shunned as unclean and unseemly, tainted by their close contact with death. The body-snatching scandals eventually led to a change in the law. The Anatomy Act of 1832 expanded the legal supply of medical cadavers to include unclaimed bodies from prisons and workhouses, reducing the demand for illicit grave robbing. But for the gravediggers, the stigma and the hardships of the job remained. It was a grim way to make a living, surrounded constantly by reminders of life's fragility and brevity. Many gravediggers turned to alcohol to cope with the emotional toll of their work, seeking solace at the bottom of a bottle. Others found dark humor to be a useful coping mechanism, cracking morbid jokes about their customers and their one-way trips to the cemetery. Gallows humor, one might say. So, next time you find yourself strolling through a peaceful, grassy cemetery, take a moment to remember the Victorian grave diggers and the vital but thankless job they performed. Theirs was a life spent in service to the dead, a hard and harrowing existence from first to last. They played a crucial but often overlooked role in the cycle of life and death, ensuring that even in a society rife with poverty and disease, everyone had a place to rest in the end. The dreadful work of rat catching. In the teeming cities of Victorian England, rats were a constant scourge. They scoured through the garbage-strewn streets, lurked in the sewers, and infested homes and businesses with impunity, carrying disease and destruction wherever they went. Rats were more than just a nuisance. They were a serious threat to public health and safety. Enter the rat catcher, a brave and intrepid soul tasked with keeping the rodent hordes at bay. Professional rat catchers were in high demand in Victorian times. They used a variety of methods to ply their trade, including traps, poisons, and specially trained dogs. The most effective rat catchers were those who had a deep understanding of rat behavior and habits. They knew where the rats liked to hide, what foods they were attracted to, and how to outsmart them at every turn. One of the most famous rat catchers of the Victorian era was Jack Black, who served as Queen Victoria's official royal rat catcher. Black was a colourful character known for his flamboyant dress and showmanship. He would arrive at a job site with great fanfare, announcing his presence with a blast from his horn and a flourish of his silver-tipped cane. But beneath the theatrics, Black was a master of his craft. He claimed to have cleared infestations from some of the most prestigious buildings in England, including Buckingham Palace itself. Armed with his trusty rat tongs and a variety of secret poisons and concoctions, Black waged a tireless war against the rodent invaders. Of course, not all rat catchers were as celebrated as Jack Black. For many, it was a dirty, dangerous, and poorly paid job. Rat catchers often worked in the most squalid and unsanitary conditions, crawling through sewers and gutters in search of their quarry. They were constantly at risk of being bitten by the rats they hunted, exposing them to a host of diseases like rabies and Wild's disease. In addition to the obvious hazards, rat catchers also faced a certain amount of social stigma. They were often looked down upon as dirty and disreputable, their close association with vermin making them outcasts in polite society. Many rat catchers lived a nomadic existence, travelling from town to town in search of work, and sleeping rough when no other accommodations could be found. Despite the challenges and hardships, rat catchers took a certain pride in their work. They saw themselves as protectors of the public good, unsung heroes battling a relentless enemy. Some even turned their skills into a form of entertainment, participating in the cruel and bizarre spectacle of rat baiting. In a typical rat baiting match, a dog would be thrown into a pit filled with hundreds of rats, and bets would be placed on how many rodents the dog could kill before succumbing to exhaustion or injury. The most famous rat-baiting dog of the Victorian era was a terrier named Billy, who allegedly killed 100 rats in just 5.5 minutes. While rat-baiting was eventually outlawed as a barbaric blood sport, it remains a dark and disturbing chapter in the history of rat catching. As the Victorian era drew to a close, advances in sanitation and pest control began to reduce the rat population in England's cities. New methods like mass-produced poisons and traps made the traditional rat catcher skills less essential, but for a time, these intrepid men and women served as the last line of defense against a furry tide of teeth and claws. So the next time you see a rat scurry across your path, spare a thought for the Victorian rat catchers and the daunting task they faced. Theirs was a dirty, dangerous, and often thankless job, but one that was vital to the health and well-being of an entire society. In their own small way, they helped to make the world a safer and more livable place, one rat at a time. The nauseating job of leech collecting. In the strange and sometimes horrifying annals of Victorian medicine, few creatures played as pivotal a role as the humble leech. These slimy, blood-sucking worms were widely used for bloodletting, a practice believed to cure everything from headaches to hemorrhoids. The thinking was that by removing excess or bad blood from the body, the patient's humours would be brought back into balance, restoring health and vitality. Of course, we now know that bloodletting is at best useless and at worst actively harmful. But in the Victorian era, leeches were in high demand, and procuring them was big business. Enter the leech collector, a hardy soul who waded into ponds and marshes to gather these squishy little physicians by the thousands. Leech collecting was a job that often fell to the poorest and most desperate members of society. Many collectors were women and children who would wade bare-legged into leech-infested waters and stand perfectly still, waiting for the worms to latch onto their skin. A skilled collector could gather hundreds of leeches in a single day, filling wooden pails or leather bags with their wriggling, writhing cargo. One of the most prolific leech collectors of the Victorian era was a woman named Teresa Smith, who worked the bogs and marshes of Norfolk. Smith was renowned for her ability to tolerate the bites of hundreds of leeches at a time, standing stoically as the creatures drank their fill of her blood. On a good day, she could collect 500 to 600 leeches, earning a meagre wage for her efforts. But the job of leech collecting was not without its hazards. In addition to the discomfort of having dozens of slimy creatures sucking at one's skin, collectors faced the constant risk of infection from the bites. Leeches can transmit a variety of bacterial and parasitic diseases, including a potentially deadly condition called sepsis. There was also the ever-present danger of accidentally ingesting a leech. It wasn't uncommon for collectors to accidentally swallow a leech or two while on the job, leading to a range of unpleasant symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, and difficulty breathing. In some cases, the ingested leeches could even attach themselves to the walls of the throat or stomach, causing serious medical complications. Despite the risks and hardships, leech collectors played a vital role in the medical industry of Victorian England. The leeches they gathered were shipped far and wide to hospitals, doctors' offices, and even to the battlefields of Europe. In the trenches of the Crimean War, leeches were used to treat everything from gunshot wounds to dysentery with mixed results. As the Victorian era progressed, however, attitudes towards bloodletting began to shift. New medical theories and technologies emerged, and the practice gradually fell out of favour. By the end of the 19th century, the once thriving leech trade had all but collapsed, and the job of leech collector faded into obscurity. Today, the idea of wading into a leech-infested swamp and offering oneself up as a meal seems almost unimaginably gruesome. But for the leech collectors of Victorian England, it was just another day's work. A nauseating, nerve-wracking, and strangely necessary job in a world where medicine was still as much art as science. So the next time you find yourself feeling grateful for modern healthcare, take a moment to remember the leech collectors and the sacrifices they made in the name of healing. Theirs was a job that required a strong stomach, a steady hand, and an unwavering devotion to the cause. They may not have had the most glamorous or respected job in Victorian society, but without them, the medical world of the time would have been a very different place. The precarious work of chimney sweeps. In the smoke-filled cities of Victorian England, chimneys were a ubiquitous sight. Every home and business had at least one, belching out a constant stream of coal smoke and ash. Keeping these chimneys clean and free of obstruction was a vital task, one that fell to a special class of worker known as the chimney sweep. Chimney sweeping was a dirty, dangerous, and often deadly job. The work was typically done by young boys, some as young as 4 or 5 years old, who were small enough to climb into the narrow, twisting flue. These climbing boys would shimmy up the chimney using their knees and elbows, scraping away the accumulated soot and ash with a brush or a metal scraper. The hazards of the job were many and varied. The constant inhalation of soot and ash could lead to respiratory problems like asthma and lung cancer. The climbing itself was treacherous with the ever-present risk of falling or getting stuck in a narrow passage. Many chimney sweeps suffered from deformities and stunted growth due to the cramped, contorted positions they were forced to work in. Perhaps the most horrifying danger of all was the risk of suffocation. It was not uncommon for climbing boys to get trapped in chimneys and die of asphyxiation before they could be rescued. One such case was that of George Brewster, a young chimney sweep who became stuck in a flue in Edinburgh in 1875. Despite desperate efforts to free him, Brewster died of suffocation after being trapped for over 2 hours. The life of a chimney sweep was a harsh and brutal one. Most were orphans or children from desperately poor families, sold into apprenticeship by their parents or guardians. They worked long hours for little pay, often sleeping in cold, damp cellars or attics when they weren't on the job. Abuse and neglect were rampant, with many masters treating their apprentices as little more than disposable labor. One chimney sweep who managed to survive the rigors of the job was James Seawood, who began his apprenticeship at the age of 6. Seawood endured years of hardship and abuse, but eventually managed to strike out on his own as a master sweep. He became an outspoken advocate for reform in the chimney sweeping trade, pushing for better working conditions and the abolition of child labor. Seawood's efforts, along with those of other reformers, eventually led to the passage of the Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875, which prohibited the use of climbing boys and required sweeps to be licensed and regulated. But change was slow to come, and many sweeps continue to use child labor well into the 20th century. Today, the image of the chimney sweep is a quaint and nostalgic one, conjuring up visions of Dick Van Dyke dancing on the rooftops in Mary Poppins. But the reality of the job was far from a cheerful fantasy. For the climbing boys of Victorian England, chimney sweeping was a precarious and often deadly occupation, one that robbed them of their health, their childhood, and all too often their lives. So the next time you curl up in front of a cozy fire, take a moment to remember the chimney sweeps and the sacrifices they made to keep the home fires burning. Theirs was a job that required bravery, resilience, and an almost superhuman ability to endure hardship and pain. They may not have had the most glamorous or celebrated job in Victorian society, but without them, the world would have been a colder and darker place. Conclusion. As we've seen, the working lives of the Victorian poor were filled with hardship, danger, and despair. From the dark, dank coal mines to the smoggy streets of London, the men, women, and children of the 19th century toiled in conditions that would be unimaginable to most of us today. They faced long hours, low pay, and constant exposure to disease, injury, and death, all in the name of survival. But even in the midst of such unrelenting misery, there were glimmers of hope and resilience. The Victorian era saw the rise of the labour movement, with workers banding together to demand better conditions and fair treatment. Reformers like Charles Booth and James Seward fought tirelessly to expose the abuses of the industrial system and push for change. And change did come, albeit slowly and painfully. The Factory Acts of the late 19th century began to regulate child labour and improve working conditions in mills and factories. The Chimney Sweepers Act of 1875 prohibited the use of climbing boys and required sweeps to be licensed and regulated. The Match Girl Strike of 1888 brought attention to the plight of female factory workers and helped pave the way for the formation of unions. Of course, the struggle for workers' rights is far from over. Even today around the world, millions of people still toil in conditions that would be familiar to their Victorian counterparts. Child labour, sweatshop conditions, and hazardous work environments are still all too common in many parts of the globe. But as we reflect on the lives and struggles of the Victorian working class, we can take heart in the progress that has been made. We can honour the sacrifices and the bravery of those who came before us, who fought and sometimes died for the rights and protections we enjoy today. And we can continue to work towards a world where no one has to endure the kind of misery and exploitation that was once the norm for so many. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep, spare a thought for the chimney sweeps and the leech collectors, the matchstick makers and the grave diggers. Remember their stories and their struggles, and let them inspire you to fight for a better, fairer world for all. And if you enjoyed this little journey through the worst jobs of the Victorian era, be sure to like and subscribe for more fascinating and mildly depressing tales from history. Until next time, sweet dreams. And be thankful you don't have to spend your days knee-deep in leeches or soot. Good night. Good